What if the calm you're seeking isn't lost but simply waiting in silence? In our busy lives, we often forget how to be still. Zen meditation and ancient Buddhist stories show us the way back to that quiet place inside. These peaceful tales carry timeless truths that help us let go of worry, soften our minds, and rediscover balance. Stillness isn't far, it's already here, gently waiting for you to notice. Let's get started. The silence between Master Rinzai's footsteps. In the quiet hills of ancient China, Master Rinzai was known for his powerful teachings and unpredictable ways. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his words struck like lightning sharp, clear, unforgettable. Yet his greatest lesson was not something he said. It was something his students heard in the silence. One autumn morning, before sunrise, Rinzai left the temple alone and began walking down a narrow forest path. A young monk, curious and eager to learn, followed from a distance. Rinzai didn't acknowledge him. He simply walked each step slow, firm, deliberate. The forest was still except for the soft rustle of leaves and the steady crunch of gravel underfoot. The monk noticed something strange. The deeper into the forest Rinzai walked, the quieter everything seemed. Even the birds, usually lively at dawn, were silent. It was as if the world held its breath. The monk listened. He heard the sound of Rinzai's feet, and then nothing. A pause between steps, so deep and still, it felt like the earth had stopped turning. With every step Rinzai took, there was a stillness that followed, not empty, not cold, but full of something the monk could not explain. They reached a clearing, and Rinzai finally turned to him. "Did you hear the silence?" he asked. The monk, startled, could only nod. Rinzai smiled and said, "That is where truth lives." The monk sat down right where he stood. No words, no teachings, just the rhythm of footsteps and the vastness between them. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be truly present. The silence was not empty, it was alive, and in that stillness he felt everything: the wind, the trees, his own heartbeat, the depth of his longing, and the gentle presence of peace. Moral of the story: stillness is not the absence of movement, it is the awareness within it. In moments of silence, we can hear the voice of wisdom. Master Rinzai taught that the space between things, between thoughts, between steps, between sounds is where clarity awakens. When we slow down and pay attention to the quiet in our lives, we discover that truth doesn't shout, it whispers. The next story is called When the Bell Rang for No One. In a remote Zen monastery nestled high in the misty mountains of Japan, there stood a great bronze bell in the center of the courtyard. Tall and weathered, it had not rung in many years, not since the time of an old abbot whose voice had been softer than the wind and whose teachings were found more in silence than in words. Monks passed by it daily on their way to meditation, barely noticing its presence. It had become like the stone's part of the background, unmoving, forgotten. One icy winter morning, just before dawn, a new novice arrived. Young, eager, and uncertain, he had traveled for weeks through deep snow just to reach this sacred place. On his first day, he was assigned to sweep the courtyard. As he moved his broom near the bell, he paused. He looked up at the massive structure and wondered why it no longer rang. There was no ceremony, no gathering, no announcement. Still, something in his heart stirred. Without thinking, he stepped forward and gently touched the wooden mallet. Then he struck the bell. A deep, haunting tone poured out like a wave, echoing across the hills, through the trees, and into the sleeping halls. It was not loud, it was steady, low, and full of something ancient. No one had told him to do it. No one had been there to hear it. And yet, the sound awakened something in every monk. They rose from their mats with tears in their eyes, unsure why. Some said it reminded them of home. Others felt it was a call from within, but no one questioned who had struck the bell. It didn't matter. The young novice stood silently beside it, hands at his sides, feeling more seen in that one moment than in his whole life. Not because someone had watched him, but because the silence after the sound had spoken back. Moral of the story: sometimes the most powerful things we do are the ones no one sees. When we act from a place of deep sincerity, not for attention, not for praise, we awaken truths that touch others in ways we may never know. Just as the bell rang for no one and yet stirred everyone, our quietest moments often echo the loudest in the hearts of others. The next story is called The Bamboo Grove That Never Grew. Long ago, on the edge of a quiet village in northern India, there was a patch of land behind a small monastery. A sign placed there read, "Future Bamboo Grove, a place for stillness." For years, the monks had hoped to grow a bamboo garden for walking meditation, shade, and peace. They planted many seeds, blessed the soil, and waited patiently through seasons of sun, wind, and rain. But nothing ever grew. The land remained barren, no shoots, no green, no sign of life. The villagers whispered about the cursed earth. Some monks believed it was their karma, others wanted to give up and plant elsewhere. But one elderly monk, thin, quiet, and often overlooked, came every morning to sit near the empty ground. He brought no tools, no seeds. He simply sat in stillness and watched the soil, as if waiting for it to speak. One morning, a young monk approached him and asked, "Why do you sit here? There is nothing to see. Nothing will grow." The old monk looked at him with kind eyes and said, "You are wrong. Something has already grown." The young monk looked around, confused. "But there's only dry dirt." The old monk pointed to his chest. "Here," he said. "Each morning I sit. I feel the ground inside me soften. I see where my impatience used to be. I see how I tried to force life to bloom when it wasn't ready. This grove has taught me more than any garden could." Years passed. Still no bamboo grew. The land remained the same, but the monks changed. They stopped coming to the grove to wait for something to happen. Instead, they came to listen, to reflect, to feel the quiet presence of earth that had nothing to prove. The bamboo grove that never grew became the most visited place in the monastery, not for what it gave, but for what it revealed. Moral of the story: growth does not always look the way we expect. Sometimes stillness is the lesson. We often rush to see results, to fix, to measure progress. But the deepest transformations happen quietly, beneath the surface, without visible signs. In the spaces where nothing seems to grow, our inner garden is learning how to bloom. The next story is called A Stone That Wept During Session. At a remote Zen temple hidden among cedar trees, the monks gathered for session, a week-long period of deep, silent meditation. No words, no eye contact, no distractions. Just the breath, the body, and the moment. It was said that during session, even the wind moved more quietly. One year, during the 5th day of practice, the youngest monk sat cross-legged in the garden, facing a large, smooth stone near the koi pond. He had struggled deeply with meditation. His mind raced. His heart ached with memories he could not shake. Grief, fear, and confusion rose within him like waves. He felt ashamed everyone else seemed calm. He, on the other hand, was falling apart in silence. In a moment of quiet desperation, he looked up and noticed something strange. A single droplet of water slid down the face of the stone. Then another, and another. It was not raining. The morning sun was rising. There was no dew, and yet the stone wept. He blinked, thinking it was his tired eyes. But the drops continued. Tiny beads of water appeared at the top of the rock and rolled slowly down its face, catching the sunlight like tears. No other stone around it was wet. The young monk stared, unmoving, breath held. Something in him broke open. Tears welled in his own eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition. He realized that he had spent so long trying to hide his pain, to appear composed, to be a good monk, that he had forgotten what it meant to simply feel. The weeping stone mirrored his own unspoken sorrow. It had given him permission to be exactly as he was. After session ended, he quietly asked the abbot if he had ever noticed the weeping stone. The abbot smiled softly and said, "Yes, it only weeps when someone is ready to be seen." The young monk returned to the stone often, not to meditate but to sit in honest silence, no longer ashamed of the storms within him. Moral of the story: true meditation is not about escaping pain, it's about holding it gently, without judgment. In silence, what we've hidden begins to rise. Like the weeping stone, the heart sometimes needs to cry, not to be fixed, but to be felt. When we stop pretending and start listening, healing begins in the stillness. The next story is called The Novice Who Meditated with Ghosts. In the hills above a quiet river valley, there was a small Zen temple known not for its beauty, but for its strange past. Long ago, a war had swept through the land, and many lives were lost on that very ground. The temple was built in silence and remembrance, where once there had been only grief. A young novice named Anju came to the temple seeking peace. He was quiet, sincere, and burdened by his own fears. He had lost his family in a fire years ago and carried the heavy ache of that memory deep in his chest. He hoped that meditation would help him forget the pain. On his second night at the temple, Anju sat for evening zazen in the dim meditation hall. The candles flickered gently. The wind whistled through the paper walls. All was still until he felt something shift. It wasn't fear exactly, but a strange presence, like being watched by something that could not be seen. He opened his eyes briefly. The room was empty. But then he saw it just for a moment, a flicker of movement across the far side of the hall, a shadow without a source, a figure sitting in perfect posture, then vanishing like breath on a mirror. His chest tightened, the air felt heavier, yet he did not move. Each night that followed, Anju returned to the hall, and each night the presence returned too. At first he was afraid, but gradually something changed. He began to feel not threatened, but accompanied. The shadows did not harm him. They simply sat, in silence, as if they too were seeking peace. One night, the abbot joined him and said softly, "You see them, don't you?" Anju nodded. The abbot placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "This land remembers. So do they. And so do you. Don't chase the ghosts away. Sit with them. Let them be." From then on, Anju meditated each night, not alone, but with those who had come, before those who had suffered, lost, wandered, and stayed. And slowly, the pain he had carried began to soften, not because it disappeared, but because it was finally seen. Moral of the story: healing does not come from turning away from the past. It comes from sitting with it, in compassion and courage. We all carry ghosts' memories, regrets, losses, but when we meet them with stillness instead of fear, they transform. What once haunted us begins to guide us home. The next story is called Master Tetsu's One Breath a Day. In a quiet valley surrounded by pine-covered hills, there lived an old Zen master named Tetsu. He was known across the land not for his talks or his writings or his temple. He had none of those. What he was known for was something strange, even unbelievable. Master Tetsu was said to take only one conscious breath a day. Pilgrims and monks would travel for miles to see him, to ask how a man could live like that. But whenever they arrived, he would smile, bow, and say nothing. He spent most of his day in silence, walking slowly through the forest, sometimes pausing under a tree, other times standing still beside a stream for hours. He never rushed. He never appeared distracted. Everything he did felt deliberate, like even time bowed to his stillness. One day, a young traveler, restless and skeptical, finally approached him with frustration. "How can one breath a day be enough?" he asked. "It takes thousands of breaths just to live. What kind of teaching is that?" Master Tetsu turned to him and nodded. "Yes, the body takes many breaths, but the mind, how many of those does it truly feel?" The traveler looked down. He had never thought about it that way. Tetsu continued, "Most people breathe as if they are asleep. Their breath is shallow, forgotten, but one breathfully felt, fully known, fully honored can be enough to return you to your life." Then, with the gentlest movement, Master Tetsu closed his eyes and inhaled once. The forest stilled. Even the birds seemed to pause. That one breath was not fast or slow. It was alive, as if the world itself breathed with him. When he opened his eyes, there was no need to explain. The traveler had tears in his. From that day on, he never again chased after too many teachings or too many answers. He practiced one breath at a time, and in each one found more than he ever expected. Moral of the story: we live our lives chasing moments, rushing through hours, and forgetting the most basic miracle of our breath. But peace isn't found in doing more. It begins in noticing what is already here. One breathfully experienced can awaken us more deeply than 1,000 thoughts. In stillness, even a single breath is enough. The next story is called "The Ink Brush That Drew Emptiness." In a small Zen monastery perched above a misty valley in China, there lived an old calligraphy master named Jian. He had once been famous throughout the empire for his brushwork characters, so fluid and alive they were said to breathe on the page. Kings and scholars had begged for his scrolls. But one day, in his old age, he left the world behind and took a vow of silence, joining the monastery to devote himself to inner stillness. Jian no longer drew for praise. He spent his days sweeping floors, gathering water, and sitting in meditation. But once a week, the abbot asked him to create a single character on a scroll for the temple wall. Just one. The monks gathered in reverent silence to watch. Each stroke was slow, precise, filled with intention. The characters radiated something beyond beauty. They carried presence. One winter morning, as snow fell silently outside, Jian dipped his brush in ink, stared at the paper, and paused. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The monks watched quietly, unsure if he had frozen in thought or fallen into deep stillness. Finally, Jian moved. He lifted the brush and made no mark. He traced an invisible character in the air, his wrist flowing, fingers steady, but he never touched the page. The brush hovered, danced, and then was set down. He bowed to the paper and stepped away. The monks stared. The scroll was blank. Some looked confused, others disappointed. One novice whispered, "He forgot." The abbot shook his head gently. "No," he said. He remembered. For weeks, the blank scroll hung in the hall. Some laughed at it, others ignored it. But a few began to notice something strange. When they sat near it, they felt calm, as if the paper itself held something sacred. There was no form, no word, no symbol, and yet the emptiness spoke. Jian never explained. He never needed to. Moral of the story: true expression does not always need shape or sound. Sometimes what is not said is the deepest teaching. Emptiness is not absent sight, is spaciousness. In stillness, in silence, in the space between strokes, we begin to see clearly. Like the ink brush that drew nothing and yet revealed everything, presence speaks louder than form. The next story is called "The Dogon Record No One Was Allowed to Read." In the ancient halls of Aheiji Temple, where Master Dogen once walked and taught, there was a small, weathered scroll locked inside a wooden box. It sat untouched on a high shelf behind the altar, wrapped in cloth and sealed with a symbol no one could name. It was known only as the Silent Record. Monks whispered that it had been written by Dogen himself during the final weeks of his life, but no one had read it. No one was allowed to. Each new abbot was instructed to protect the scroll but never open it. Generations passed. Curious minds came and went. Some tried to peek. Others dreamed of unlocking its wisdom. But none dared to break the tradition. One autumn, a young monk named Jikai arrived at Aheiji. He was sincere, humble, but deeply hungry for truth. He had read every Dogen text he could find: Shobogenzo, Fukan Zazengi, Genjo Koan. And yet, something inside him felt unfinished. Each night after Zazen, he would sit in the shadows of the altar room, staring at the sealed box, wondering what teachings might lie hidden inside. One night, after many months, he approached the old abbot. "Master," he whispered, "why are we told never to read the scroll? What if it holds the final truth Dogen wanted to share?" The abbot looked at him gently. "Many believe it does," he said. "But Dogen's greatest teaching wasn't written down. That scroll remains closed, not because of fear but because of respect. What is unwritten cannot be misread." Jikai was confused. Then why keep it at all? The abbot walked to the altar, removed the scroll, and placed it in the monk's hands. "You are now holding it," he said. "What do you feel?" Jikai held the ancient box, and something strange happened. His racing mind quieted, his breath slowed. He felt no need to open it. The silence surrounding the scroll said more than any words ever could. In that moment he understood. Dogen's final teaching was not what was inside the record, but the practice of not needing it. Moral of the story: sometimes wisdom is not in what we uncover, but in what we allow to remain closed. In a world that pushes us to know more, chase more, read more, the deepest truths often appear when we stop seeking. Just as the unopened scroll held Dogen's final silence, true insight comes not always from learning but from letting go. The next story is called The Monk Who Slept in a Coffin to Understand Impermanence. In a quiet forest temple far from any village, a young monk named Soryu struggled deeply with fear. He was devoted and disciplined, but the thought of death haunted him. During meditation, his mind filled with visions of sickness, aging, and loss. He feared the end of everything he loved, and though he studied the Buddha's teachings on impermanence, he could not feel them in his bones. One evening, after evening chants, the head monk approached Soryu and said, "If you wish to understand impermanence, don't read more sutras. Sleep where death lives." With no further explanation, he led Soryu behind the temple to a small wooden shed. Inside was a simple coffin, handcrafted from pine. "You will stay here each night," the master said, "until your fear becomes your teacher." Soryu's breath caught in his throat, but he bowed in silence. That night, with trembling hands, he climbed inside the coffin, the lid left partly open. The wood was cold, the space was tight. Every sound, an owl, a wind, a falling branch, felt like a final breath. His heart pounded. Images of his own funeral filled his mind. He could not sleep, but he stayed. The next night, and the night after, he returned. Slowly, his fear began to soften. He no longer saw the coffin as a prison, but as a mirror. Each time he laid down inside, he was reminded, "This could be my last night." The thought, once terrifying, became clarifying. He began to rise each morning with gratitude, bowing to the trees, feeling the breath in his chest, not as a habit, but as a gift. On the seventh night, something changed. As he lay still, no fear came, only silence, deep, vast silence. He saw his own impermanence not as a curse but as freedom. nothing to hold, nothing to lose, just this moment, alive and already slipping away. And that was enough. When he finally returned to the temple hall, he bowed low to the head monk, eyes full of quiet understanding. Moral of the story: to fear death is human, but to face it with open eyes is awakening. When we turn toward impermanence, not away from it, we stop clinging and start living. Like the monk who slept in the coffin, we learn that peace isn't found in avoiding change, it's found in embracing it, moment by moment, breath by breath. The next story is called The Haiku That Was Too Enlightened to Be Understood. In a quiet fishing village near the coast of Japan, there lived an old poet monk named Isan. He rarely spoke and never taught in formal ways. Instead, he wrote haiku, small poems of only a few lines. He would leave them on stones, tree trunks, or scraps of paper drifting down the stream. Villagers would find them like blessings from the wind. One spring, after 3 days of unbroken silence, Isan picked up his brush and wrote a haiku on a single slip of rice paper. He bowed to it and placed it under a rock at the edge of the temple garden. That evening, a passing monk discovered the poem. It read, "No moon, no wave. Still, the tide bows to something." The monk was puzzled. He showed it to others. Word of the poem spread quickly. Pilgrims came from nearby temples, then from far cities. Scholars studied its rhythm, debated its meaning. Some said it spoke of surrender. Others claimed it revealed the illusion of duality. A few dismissed it as nonsense, but no one truly understood. Isan, meanwhile, said nothing. He continued sweeping leaves, feeding birds, sipping tea. When asked about the poem, he only smiled and returned to his breath. Years passed. The haiku was copied, carved into stone, even taught in lectures. Yet no one could explain it completely. It became known as the poem Too Enlightened to Be Understood. One day, a child visiting the temple picked up the original slip of paper and read it aloud. He blinked, paused, then said softly, "Maybe it just means we don't have to see something to feel it." Isan, overhearing from a distance, gently closed his eyes and exhaled. The child placed the poem back under the rock. Then he ran off to chase butterflies, no longer thinking about the meaning. Moral of the story: not all truth can be explained. Some insights are meant to be felt, not solved. In our search for understanding, we often forget the beauty of mystery. The deepest teachings do not always live in knowledge, but in presence. Just like a haiku that cannot be grasped with the mind, some moments are only meant for the heart. The next story is called The Dog That Passed the Gateless Gate. In an old Zen temple surrounded by stone walls and plum trees, a famous koan echoed through the halls. Does a dog have Buddha nature? It was asked by countless students for generations, pointing toward a truth beyond words. Some answered yes, others no, but most were met with silence, the sound of a stick cracking the floor. One stormy night, as the monks gathered for evening meditation, a stray dog wandered into the temple grounds. Thin, soaked, and limping, it had no collar and no name. The monks, bound by compassion, offered it a dry cloth and some leftover rice. Most assumed it would leave by morning, but it stayed. Each day, the dog curled beside the zendo door, resting while the monks sat in stillness. It never barked, never begged. It simply watched. It followed the schedule, naturally rising at the sound of the bell, walking the same paths, sitting beside the students during chants. It never disrupted, never broke the silence. Even the abbot said, half smiling, "He understands the form better than some of us." Weeks passed. One morning, during a walking meditation, the dog suddenly stood and walked straight toward the stone gate at the edge of the monastery. It was always closed, symbolizing the gateless gate, the barrier every student must cross, though it cannot be seen. The dog walked to the gate, paused, looked back at the monks, and then walked right through it. Not around it, not over it. Through. The monks gasped. The gate remained solid, untouched, but the dog was gone, disappeared into the mist beyond the wall. Some said it was an illusion, others called it a teaching. But the abbot simply bowed deeply toward the gate and said, "Mu." From that day on, the koan changed. It was no longer, "Does a dog have Buddha nature?" It became, "Can you walk as the dog walked beyond thought, beyond self, beyond the gate?" Moral of the story: the path to awakening is not found in perfect answers, it's in letting go of the question itself. The gateless gate is not a place but a moment, when we stop seeking and start being. Like the dog, we pass through not by force, but by presence. Enlightenment is not earned, it is remembered. The next story is called The Buddha Statue That Refused Worship. In a mountain village where the mist rarely lifted, there stood an old wooden temple known for one thing: a Buddha statue, unlike any other. Carved from dark stone and seated in deep meditation, it was said to have been brought by a wandering monk who found it buried beneath a tree after a landslide. The villagers believed it was sacred. They offered flowers, incense, and coins. Some even prayed to it as if it were a god. But strange things began to happen. Each morning, the offerings would be found scattered across the floor. The incense would burn out halfway. Coins would roll off the altar. No matter how carefully people placed their gifts, by nightfall, they would be gone. Some believed it was a spirit, others said it was a curse. One elder insisted the statue didn't want to be worshipped. One day, a new monk arrived at the temple, young, curious, and kind-hearted. He heard the stories and decided to watch through the night. He sat in stillness as the wind rustled through the paper walls. At midnight, the air grew heavy. A sudden creak echoed through the room. Then, slowly, before his eyes, the statue shifted. Not by force, not by hand. The Buddha's eyes, carved half-closed, seemed to soften. The monk could feel it, not fear, not anger, but a quiet refusal. A presence that said, "Do not bow to me, wake up with me." He understood. The next morning, he cleared the altar. No more flowers, no more coins. Instead, he placed a simple bowl of water and sat in meditation beside it. Others followed. No more prayers for favor. Just presence, breath, silence. From then on, the statue never moved again. Years later, the monk would say, "That statue never asked to be worshipped. It asked us to remember who we are." Moral of the story: true reverence is not found in worshipping symbols, but in awakening to what they point toward. The Buddha never wanted to be idolized. He wanted others to see their own awakened nature. Like the statue that refused worship, the greatest teachers remind us not to kneel, but to rise. The next story is called The Rain Monk Who Chanted to the Sky. In a dry and dusty village on the edge of a forgotten mountain range, there had been no rain for months. Crops had withered, wells ran low. Hope was becoming thin, like the cracked earth beneath their feet. The villagers tried everything: rituals, prayers, offerings, but the sky remained silent. One day, an old monk appeared, walking alone along the winding road. His robes were worn, his staff made of plain wood, and his face calm like still water. The villagers rushed to him and begged, "Please, do you know how to call the rain?" He bowed gently and said, "I do not call the rain, I simply chant to the sky." Confused but desperate, they led him to the center of the village, where he placed a small cushion on the bare ground and sat. He lit no incense. He built no altar. He simply folded his legs, closed his eyes, and began to chant. The sound was soft, just a hum, barely more than a whisper. It rose and fell like breathing. Hour after hour, he chanted, not to demand, not to ask, but to harmonize, to match the rhythm of the earth below and the silence of the sky above. The villagers waited. Some mocked him quietly, others watched in awe. On the third day, as dawn broke, clouds began to gather. The air thickened, the wind changed direction, and then rain. Gentle at first, then steady. The village rejoiced. Children ran through puddles, elders wept with relief. The monk did not move. He kept chanting as the rain fell, soaking him completely. Only when the last villager had gone inside did he open his eyes and smile. One bold child asked him, "Did you make the sky cry?" He laughed softly and said, "No. I listened until the sky remembered how." The villagers begged him to stay, to teach them how he did it. But the monk simply replied, "When you chant not to change the world, but to become one with it, then even the clouds may hear." Moral of the story: true harmony comes not from control, but from connection. When we stop demanding and start aligning with nature, with silence, with truther, presence itself becomes a prayer. The rain monk did not force the sky to open. He simply became so still, the sky could not help but answer. The next story is called The Orphan and the Talking Gather. In a dusty village surrounded by fields of withered grass, there lived a young orphan named Nalin. He had no family, no home, and no memory of his parents. People gave him scraps of food and old clothes, but no one gave him kindness. Most days he sat alone under the banyan tree at the edge of the village, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick, wondering why he was even born. One afternoon, while wandering behind an abandoned shrine, Nalin found an old scroll wedged between two broken stones. It was torn and stained, the writing nearly faded, but at the top were 4 simple lines written in soft black ink. From breath to breath, the heart learns to bow. Even in sorrow, the path remains now. He read the words aloud softly. To his surprise, a breeze stirred the leaves. He read it again. This time, something strange happened. The words echoed not from his mouth, but from somewhere deep inside his chest. They felt alive. Each day, he returned to the same place and read the lines. And slowly, they began to speak not in sound, but in feeling. When he was hungry, they said, "This moment is still whole." When he was cold, breathe into the ache, and warmth will return. When he wept without reason, even tears are part of the path. The Gather didn't change his life. Outside he was still alone, still poor. But inside, something softened. He stopped wishing for the past he never had. He stopped fearing the future he couldn't see. He simply began to walk, eat, sleep, and sit with presence. Years later, a wandering monk visited the village and saw Nalin sitting beneath the banyan tree, calm, peaceful, a quiet stillness around him that made birds come closer and children stop to listen. "Who is your teacher?" the monk asked. Nalin smiled and replied, "A single verse that remembered me when no one else did." Moral of the story: sometimes the gentlest truths come when the world is silent. We search for answers in people, places, and things, but often it is a single teaching, a line of wisdom that stays with us like a friend. Like the Gatha that spoke to the orphan, the Dharma finds us when the heart is ready to listen. Even one breath of truth can change a life. The next story is called The Broken Mala That Told Time. In a quiet forest temple nestled between 2 rivers, an elderly monk named Tamo was known for his unusual ways. He didn't carry a clock or follow the temple bell. Instead, he kept a single string of mala bead sewn, 108 smooth wooden beads, darkened by years of prayer and touch. Monks would often see him moving the beads between his fingers, eyes closed, lips silent. It was said he always arrived exactly on time for every activity without ever being told the hour. One morning during work practice, a young monk noticed something strange. As Tammo helped sweep the courtyard, his mala string snapped. The beads scattered across the stones like tiny marbles, rolling into corners and under bushes. The young monk ran to help gather them, full of worry. "Master, your beads are broken. How will you keep time now?" Tammo smiled gently, kneeling down. He picked up a single bead and held it in the sunlight. "I never kept time," he said. "I kept presence." The young monk looked puzzled. Tammo explained, "Each bead was not a second or a minute. It was a breath, a thought, a prayer, a moment noticed. I didn't count the hours. I counted awareness." He didn't rebuild the mala. Instead, he placed the loose beads in a small cloth bag and carried them with him. From then on, he would reach in, take one bead in his hand, and sit with it quietly. No string, no order, no need. Every bead became its own world, its own pause in the rushing river of time. Years later, the young Mono, older, would teach this same lesson to others. He carried a bead in his pocket, not to pray, but to remember that time is not a clock ticking forward. Time is attention. Time is now. Moral of the story: we often chase hours and days, always moving, always measuring. But real time lives in presence, not numbers. Like the broken mala, life may fall out of order, but each moment still holds meaning. When we stop counting and start noticing, even a single breath can hold eternity. The next story is called Zen in the Time of Earthquakes. In the coastal city of Sendai, where the earth sometimes groaned beneath quiet streets, there lived an elderly Zen nun named Kaori. Her temple was modest, just 5 rooms, and a garden of moss and stone. She spent her days in stillness, teaching meditation to anyone who came. Shopkeepers, school children, and tired workers would gather on bamboo mats to breathe and listen. Her voice was soft, like wind through reeds, and her presence felt like a warm cup held between 2 hands. Then, without warning, the earthquake came. It was early morning. The floor shuddered, walls cracked, windows shattered in a sudden scream of glass. People ran. Screams filled the air. Chaos broke open the silence. Buildings collapsed. The temple roof split. Dust and panic rose as one. But Kaori did not move. She was in the meditation hall, seated in lotus, eyes half closed. As the earth roared beneath her, she simply breathed. The scrolls on the wall fell. Statues tipped. The world broke apart around her stillness. When it was over, the sun pushed through the clouds like a slow forgiveness. The city lay shaken and raw. People wandered through the rubble, stunned. But at the temple, they found Kaori still sitting, her robes dust-covered, her spine upright, her breath steady. One child approached her and asked through trembling lips, "Weren't you scared?" She opened her eyes and replied, "Yes, but fear too passes through the breath." She stood slowly and began clearing broken tiles, one by one. Others joined her. They didn't speak much. They just moved, lifted, swept, comforted. Someone began boiling water. Someone else lit incense from a splintered beam. And soon, without trying, the temple became a refuge, not because it stood whole, but because something within it remained unbroken. Kaori never spoke of the earthquake again, but from that day on, more people came to meditate. Not to escape the world, but to sit with it, even as it shook. Moral of the story: Zen does not promise safety, it offers presence. When life trembles beneath our feet, the practice is not to run, but to return, to the breath, to the body, to this moment. Like the nun in the quake, stillness does not deny, fear it holds it, breathes with it, and waits for it to pass like every other storm. The next story is called The Master Who Taught by Not Speaking for 20 Years. High in the mountains of Korea, there was a monastery cloaked in clouds and silence. It was a place where travelers rarely ventured, except for those who had heard the strange legend of a Zen master who had not spoken a single word in 20 years. His name was Master Hyun, and he had once been a brilliant orator, sharp, poetic, revered. But one morning, after delivering a powerful teaching on the emptiness of words, he simply stopped speaking. No announcement, no farewell, just silence. And from that day forward, he taught only with his presence. New monks arrived full of questions. They bowed before him, hoping for answers, hoping for wisdom they could write down. He only smiled, placed a teacup in their hands, and looked into their eyes. He swept leaves from the garden paths with quiet care. He bowed to the rain. He stared at the moon as if it was speaking volumes, but still no words. Many left, frustrated or confused. But those who stayed began to notice something changing in themselves. In the stillness of Master Hyun's silence, their thoughts became louder, then softer, then clearer. They began to hear things they'd never heard before: the sound of their breath, the way a sparrow lands on a branch, the beating of their own hearts. One day, a young monk who had struggled with self-doubt knelt beside him and whispered, "I am nothing. I don't belong here." Master Hyun turned to him, reached out, and gently touched the monk's chest, then pointed to a blooming flower growing from a crack in the stone floor. Not a word passed between them, and yet the monk burst into tears. Not from sadness, but from being fully seen for the first time. When Master Hyun finally passed away, the monks gathered in silence. There were no final teachings, no grand last words, only the wind moving through the temple and the deep, sacred hush he had left behind. Moral of the story: silence is not the absence of teaching, it is its purest form. Words can point the way, but presence reveals the truth. Like Master Hyun, we too can learn to speak with our stillness, to listen without interrupting, and to discover that what needs to be known often waits in the spaces where nothing is said. The next story is called The Candle That Burned Only When No One Looked. In a secluded Zen temple hidden deep in the mountains, there was a single room that no one entered except during evening ceremonies. At the center of this room stood a small, unremarkable candle placed on a stone pedestal. It wasn't ornate or large, just a simple white candle in a copper holder. The strange thing about this candle was that no one had ever seen it burn. The monks would light it before leaving the room as part of a long-held tradition. But when they returned the next day, they'd find it half melted, its wax spilled gently down the sides. Yet no smoke lingered, and no light had been seen through the thin rice paper walls. They began to call it the hidden flame. One novice, filled with curiosity, decided he had to know the truth. "I will sit quietly and watch all night," he whispered to himself. "I will catch the flame in the act." So, after evening chants, he crept into the room and sat in the corner, his breath soft, eyes wide open. Hours passed. The candle sat still. It did not flicker. It did not glow. It remained cold and untouched. Sometime around midnight, the novice blinked just once, and, in that instant, the room seemed to shift. When he opened his eyes again, the candle was shorter. Wax pooled freshly around the base. He gasped. But again, no flame. The next night, he tried again, this time with deeper stillness, less force. He let go of the need to catch the candle burning and simply sat. He didn't try to see, but just to be. And for a moment only, a momentha felt warmth against his face, a soft glow, not from the eyes but from within. Then it was gone. In the morning, the abbot found him sitting peacefully beside the melted candle. "Did you see it?" the abbot asked gently. The novice smiled faintly. "No," he said, "but I felt it." The abbot nodded. "That's the only way to truly know." Moral of the story: some truths do not appear when chased. They arise when we stop looking for them with the mind and begin to feel them with the heart. Like the candle that burns only when no one watches, inner light cannot be forced into view. It comes in stillness, in surrender, in the quiet space where awareness begins and the self disappears. The next story is called The Kitchen Monk's Secret Sutra. In a large, bustling monastery on the edge of a coastal village, monks came from all over to study Zen under a well-known master. They gathered for daily teachings, recited ancient sutras, and debated deep koans in candlelit halls. Yet in the very heart of the monastery, away from the zendo and the scripture rooms, there was a kitchen where one monk quietly stirred pots, chopped roots, and boiled rice day after day, unnoticed by most. His name was Brother Jun, and he had been in the monastery longer than anyone could remember. He never taught, he never gave talks, he never answered questions. But the food he prepared had a strange quality, so simple yet so nourishing that monks often wept without knowing why after their meals. Some said the taste reminded them of home. Others said it calmed their restless minds. One curious novice began to observe him closely. He noticed how Brother Jun moved through the kitchen, every motion precise, every breath slow. Before cutting vegetables, he would gently press his hands together. Before lighting the stove, he would whisper something only the fire seemed to understand. He cooked not with recipes, but with presence. One night, the novice tiptoed into the kitchen and found an old scroll tucked inside a cracked bamboo box beneath the counter. On it were no chants, no Sanskrit, no commentaries. Just a few lines, written in faded ink. Wash the rice as if cleansing the mind. Cut the carrot as if releasing the past. Boil the broth with breath steady and kind. Serve with emptiness. Receive with gratitude. Startled, the novice brought it to the abbot. The abbot read it and smiled. "This," he said, "is Brother Jun's sutra, passed not through words, but through hands, through steam, through service." Brother Jun never claimed it. He never needed to. His whole life had become the teaching. Moral of the story: wisdom doesn't always live in books or temples. Sometimes it stirs quietly in pots, folds itself into dumplings, and simmers in silence. The sacred is not just chanted, it is chopped, served, and shared. Like the kitchen monk's secret sutra, the most profound truths are often written in the ordinary moments we choose to live with care. The next story is called The Forgotten Sand Garden of Ryoanji. In the heart of Kyoto, behind thick temple walls, and beneath the watchful gaze of ancient pines, sits Ryoanji Zen temple, famous for its stone garden. People come from all over the world to gaze at the 15 rocks placed carefully among white-raked sand. Scholars debate its meaning. Tourists take photos. Monks sweep the sand each morning in silent meditation. But few know that, tucked behind the main hall, hidden beyond a crooked wooden gate long covered in moss, there once was another garden, smaller, simpler, forgotten. It was created centuries ago by a monk named Haruki, who never became famous, never wrote a single teaching. He spent his days shaping a tiny patch of earth for no audience but the sky. 5 stones, irregular and worn, placed as if by chance. He raked the sand each morning, not for design but for rhythm. The lines were never perfect. He let the wind reshape them. Sometimes leaves were left in place, and no one removed them. One day, a curious young monk discovered the garden while gathering firewood. "Is this yours?" he asked the aging Haruki. The old monk nodded. "I rake here, not to be seen but to disappear." The younger monk sat with him in silence, watching as the rake traced gentle curves through the sand. "What does it mean?" he finally asked. Haruki smiled. It means whatever you don't say. Years passed. Haruki grew older and eventually passed away during meditation, seated beside his little garden. With time, the temple changed. The main garden became a symbol, but Haruki's garden, quiet, imperfect, unnamed, was closed off, and over the decades, it was forgotten. Until one rainy afternoon, a modern monk wandering beyond the grounds stumbled upon the gate. Pushing it open, he saw the worn stones, the soft, unraked sand, the way silence still rested there like a visitor that never left. He sat. He wept. And then he picked up the rake. Moral of the story: not all beauty is meant for display. Not all truths need to be explained. Some gardens are made not for the eyes of the world, but for the soul of the one who tends them. Like the forgotten sand garden of Ryoanji, peace lives in the places we stop trying to perfect and simply let be. The next story is called The Cat That Meowed in Koans. In a small Zen temple nestled between blooming plum trees and tall stone lanterns, there lived a temple cat named Tama. She had soft gray fur, quiet paws, and a meow so delicate it sounded like wind through bamboo. The monks never trained her, but she followed the rhythms of the temple on her own, appearing at dawn meditation, walking through the halls during chants, and curling up beside those who were struggling to sit still. Tama was always there, and yet no one knew where she came from. She had simply arrived one spring morning and never left. One day, during a Dharma talk, the abbot posed a difficult koan to the students. What is your original face before your mother and father were born? The room was heavy with silence. The students sat frozen, minds twisting and turning in search of understanding. Just then, Tama leapt onto the altar, looked around the room, and let out a single soft meow. The abbot smiled, bowed to the cat, and ended the talk. From that day on, whenever a student struggled with a koan, Tama seemed to appear. She would walk around them slowly, gaze into their eyes, and meow on Seneva more. Some laughed, some grew annoyed. Others broke down in tears. But over time, the monks began to sense something deeper in her presence. She was not solving the koans. She was responding beyond thought. Her meow wasn't an answer, it was an interruption. A reminder to return to the moment, to drop the mind's grasping, to feel instead of analyze. One monk, after years of silence and doubt, finally understood. As Tama brushed against his legs and meowed, he laughed not because he got the answer, but because he no longer needed one. Tama lived a long life at the temple. When she passed, they buried her under the old zendo with a single stone above her grave. On it, they carved just one word: Mu. Moral of the story: the truth can't always be found by thinking harder. Some answers come only when the mind lets go. Like the cat who meowed in koans, sometimes the simplest sound, the gentlest nudge, is the gateway to awakening. Presence speaks where logic cannot. Listen not with your mind, but with your being. The next story is called The Temple on Fire, Where No One Panicked. Long ago, in a remote village nestled between two steep mountains, there was a Zen temple known for its deep stillness. The monks there were said to be so present, so rooted in awareness, that even their movements seemed to float. Travelers would come just to witness the silence that lived between their footsteps. One summer afternoon, as the monks gathered in the main hall for walking meditation, lightning struck a nearby tree. The tree, dry from weeks without rain, burst into flames. The fire quickly jumped to the temple roof, and within minutes, smoke filled the air. A villager nearby saw the flames rising and ran toward the temple shouting, "Fire! Fire! The temple is burning!" But something strange happened. The monks did not scream or run. They did not cry or flail. They moved calmly, some began carrying buckets of water from the well. Others led the older monks to safety, and a few returned to the meditation hall to gather sacred texts, their robes soaked with sweat and ash. There was no panic, only presence. The villagers watching were stunned. One shouted, "Why are you not afraid?" An elderly monk, his hands blackened from smoke, replied, "We are afraid, but we are not ruled by it." Even as the flames consumed one wing of the temple, the monks moved as if they were tending a garden, not fleeing a disaster. Their breaths were steady, their steps sure. One monk stood barefoot on burning embers to guide a frightened novice through the smoke. When the fire was finally put out, much of the temple was gone. But the zendo, where they meditated each morning, still stood. That evening, covered in ash and sweat, the monks gathered inside, just as they always did. No one spoke of loss. No one clung to what had been. They bowed to the moment, to what was left, to what could never be burned. Moral of the story: true peace is not the absence of crisis, but the calm we carry into it. When we train the mind in stillness, even fire cannot shake us. Like the monks of the burning temple, we learn that panic is a habit, but presence is a choice. In chaos, clarity is still possible. In loss, there is still ground beneath our feet. The next story is called The Koan Hidden in a Teacup. In a peaceful Zen hermitage on the side of a mossy hill, a wandering student named Nari arrived after many years of searching. She had traveled from temple to temple, studying every sutra, memorizing every koan, yet still felt something was missing. Her mind was full, but her heart remained restless. She came to ask the old master, known simply as Elder K, for the final piece of truth she could not grasp. Elder K welcomed her without words, only a gentle nod and a wave toward the tea room. The room was bare of no scrolls, no statues, only 2 cushions, a low table, and a small clay teapot steaming gently. They sat together in silence. After some time, the master poured tea into Nari's cup. Slowly, carefully. The cup filled, but the tea kept coming. It spilled over, running down the sides onto the wooden floor. "Master," Nari cried, alarmed, "the cup is full." Elder K looked into her eyes and said calmly, "Yes, like your mind." Nari froze. In that instant, something cracked open inside her, not just the meaning of the act, but the experience of it. She had come seeking more knowledge, more answers, more teachings, but she had brought no space to receive them. The master handed her the cup, still wet with tea. "Your koan," he said softly, "is in here." She stared at the cup. There was no riddle, no question, no words, just warmth. Steam, emptiness, form. The truth she had chased across countries was now in her hands, weightless and clear. In the days that followed, she stopped reciting teachings aloud. She stopped asking questions. She simply drank tea, slowly, presently, and with each sip, the world became more spacious. The taste of the leaves, the sound of the boiling water, the way the light struck the rim of the clay, it all became the answer. Nari stayed for many seasons, not to learn more, but to unlearn gently, cup by cup. Moral of the story: wisdom cannot fill a cup that's already overflowing. To truly understand, we must first empty ourselves of opinions, of striving, of certainty. Like the koan hidden in a teacup, the most profound truths are often simple, quiet, and waiting in plain sight. When we stop searching and start receiving, the lesson reveals itself. The next story is called The Lotus That Bloomed in a Monastery Drain. In the rainy hills of Sri Lanka, there stood a quiet monastery, known not for its grand halls or golden statues, but for its humble simplicity. The monks there lived modestly, dedicating their lives to practice, silence, and service. Every day, they swept leaves, washed robes by hand, and cared for the old and the ill. Behind the kitchen, beside a cracked stone path, there was an old drainage channel, just a narrow groove in the ground, dark and filled with muddy runoff. It was where dishwater flowed and leaves gathered, where insects buzzed and no one paid much attention. Most monks walked past it without a second glance. But one morning, just after monsoon rains had cleared, a young novice named Pema saw something strange. He paused. There, rising from the foul-smelling drain, was a single lotus bloom, soft pink, luminous, untouched by the mud around it. He knelt beside it, stunned. How could such beauty grow here, in this forgotten corner filled with waste and rot? He called for the elder monks. They gathered around, and in deep silence simply looked. No one spoke. No one needed to. That evening, the abbot stood before the Sangha and said, "For years we've walked past this place thinking it unworthy of notice. Yet the lotus chose to rise here, without asking our permission, without waiting for cleaner water." The monks began tending to the area, not to beautify it, but to honor it. They did not clear away the mud. They let it be. They began calling it the place of becoming. Pema visited the flower each day, bowing to it before and after his chores. When asked what he learned from it, he said quietly, "Even what is unwanted holds the power to nourish beauty." Moral of the story: enlightenment doesn't bloom in perfect places. It rises through the muck of daily life, through pain, imperfection, and all we'd rather hide. Like the lotus that bloomed in a monastery drain, wisdom emerges not by escaping difficulty, but by transforming within it. Nothing is too low, too broken, or too dirty to become a ground for awakening. The next story is called The Nun Who Only Walked Backward. In a distant Zen nunnery by the sea, there lived a quiet nun named Anju, whose ways puzzled everyone. She was kind, disciplined, and deeply devoted, but she had one strange habit: she never walked forward. Whether going to the meditation hall, the garden, or the shrine, Anju always moved backward, slowly and with great care. The younger nuns whispered about her. "She's eccentric," they said, "or maybe she's stuck in the past." Visitors often stared, but Anju never explained. She simply bowed to everyone she passed and continued moving through the world in reverse. One day, a curious novice finally asked her, "Why do you walk this way? Don't you want to see where you're going?" Anju smiled gently and said, "I want to see where I've been." That answer stayed with the novice, though she didn't fully understand it. Until one evening, during walking meditation along the ocean path, she watched Anju step backward across the stones, her eyes never leaving the trail behind her. The novice suddenly noticed something. Anju never stumbled, never rushed, never missed a detail. She saw every footprint, every fallen petal, every shift in the sand. Her awareness was full, complete, not ahead, but behind. Later that night, Anju shared her story. "When I was young," she said softly, "I rushed through everything. I ran toward enlightenment like it was a prize to win. But I left pieces of myself behind, hurts, regrets, lessons I didn't want to face. One day, during retreat, I turned around, not just physically but inwardly, and I realized I had been walking away from the very things that could have taught me peace." She paused, then whispered, "So now, I return to them, step by step." The novice wept, not from sadness, but from recognition. She too had tried to escape her past, but the path to healing, she realized, was not always forward. Anju never changed her way of walking. She didn't need to. Over time, others joined her, not to mimic her, but to remember their own path, to walk a little slower, to see what they had missed. Moral of the story: sometimes we move forward too quickly, hoping to leave our past behind. But true peace often lies in what we've left undone, unfelt, unseen. Like the nun who walked backward, we find clarity not by escaping our steps, but by returning to them with care, with presence, and with compassion. The next story is called The Spider That Meditated for 1,000 Years. Deep inside a forgotten cave on the edge of the Himalayas, there lived a spider. It was no ordinary spider, and yet to the world it seemed completely unremarkable. It spun its web in silence between two stones near the cave's mouth, where wind and light would occasionally pass through. No humans ever came, no prey disturbed its threads, and still it remained. Legend says the spider had once been a monk. Long ago, he had devoted his life to meditation but was proud of his progress. He sought praise and recognition for his discipline. On his deathbed, still clinging to the idea of achievement, he whispered, "I will return until I learn to meditate with no desire left." And so, the story goes, he was reborn not as a master, but as a spider. At first, the spider resisted. There were no mantras to chant, no cushion to sit on, no monastery to be seen, just stillness, just waiting, just breath though no lungs. Just the movement of wind through the cave and the rhythm of his own presence. Years passed, then centuries. He built webs only to let them fall. He rested in stillness. He listened to the sound of melting snow dripping from the cave's roof in spring. He felt the sun warm his web for a few seconds each day, then disappear. He stopped counting time. He stopped wanting to change. He simply was. After 1,000 years, when the last thread of craving finally dissolved, his form vanished like a shadow in sunlight. A passing monk, meditating nearby, suddenly opened his eyes and whispered, "Someone just woke up." But he saw no one. No one, except a perfect web glistening with dew, shaped like an endless circle, swaying gently in the breeze. Moral of the story: awakening does not belong to form or status, it belongs to sincerity. When we release the need to be seen as wise and simply rest in being itself, even the smallest life can touch the infinite. Like the spider who waited in silence for 1,000 years, we learn that enlightenment does not rush, it arrives when we stop asking for it and start becoming it. The next story is called The Child Who Remembered Nirvana. In a quiet village surrounded by rice fields and gentle hills, a child named Kian was born under a full moon. From the moment he could speak, he said strange things that puzzled his parents and the elders. At just 3 years old, he asked why people cried at funerals. "Don't they know it's not the end?" he said softly, watching the smoke rise from a village pyre. By the time he was 5, he would sit for hours in silence, cross-legged beneath the fig tree near the stream. While other children played, Kian simply sat, eyes wide open, a calmness far too deep for someone his age. When asked what he was doing, he would reply, "Listening to the place before sound." The villagers were both enchanted and uneasy. Some said he was blessed. Others said he must be protected. But one old monk who had once lived in the mountains came to visit and spent a day beside Kian under the fig tree. When he returned, he told the others, "This child remembers what we have all forgotten." The monk took Kian into the temple and began to guide him gently, but found he had little to teach. When asked what nirvana was, Kian said, "It's when you stop trying to be something. It's when there's no you left to be afraid." His voice didn't carry pride or cleverness. It was like someone remembering a dream from a long, long time ago. One night during meditation, the monk asked him, "Why do you never speak of suffering?" Kian replied, "Because I already walked through it, before this body." Tears filled the monk's eyes, not because he understood, but because he felt something crack open inside, something beyond words, beyond knowing. Kian never claimed to be special. He swept floors, he gathered herbs, he laughed like any child, but in his eyes there was a stillness that didn't move. He did not become a great teacher. He did not build a temple. He simply lived, fully, gently, without grasping. Moral of the story: sometimes the deepest truths aren't learned, they're remembered. Beneath our fears and stories, there is a quiet knowing we all once held. Like the child who remembered nirvana, awakening doesn't always come from effort. Sometimes it returns to us when we become simple enough to hear it. The next story is called The Tea Ceremony That Lasted a Lifetime. In a quiet village where the river curved gently around the foot of a sacred mountain, there lived a man named Haru. He was not a monk, nor a scholar, nor even a particularly spiritual man. He was a simple tea housekeeper, known only for the care with which he brewed each cup of tea. Haru had been taught by his grandmother, who whispered to him once, "A cup of tea is not just a drink. It is a moment that can hold eternity if you notice it." He remembered those words, and so every morning, before the first customer arrived, Haru prepared a single cup of tea in silence. He did not rush. He bowed to the steam rising from the water. He let each movement pouring, stirring, lifting be slow and full of attention. He never missed a morning, not once, for over 60 years. Travelers who visited the village would hear rumors of his tea. "It tastes like nothing and everything," some said. "It's just tea," others replied, but those who drank it never forgot it. Because when Haru served tea, he served stillness. He served presence. He served a moment where everything else paused: grief, memory, desire, fear, and only the warmth of the cup remained. One day, as he grew very old, a monk visited his tea house and asked, "How long have you practiced the way?" Haru looked up, surprised. "I don't practice anything," he said. The monk smiled. "And yet, you have completed the longest tea ceremony I've ever known." That night, Haru sat alone in his small garden with his final cup. The moon hung low. The steam curled like a prayer. He held the cup in both hands, took one sip, and gently closed his eyes. He never woke again. They found him sitting upright, hands still cradling the empty cup, a look of peace on his face, so deep it silenced even the birds. Moral of the story: spiritual practice is not always loud or visible. It can live in the quiet repetition of daily life, in a single act, done with full attention, over and over. Like the tea ceremony that lasted a lifetime, awakening is not always sudden. Sometimes it is steeped slowly, moment by moment, until one day we become the stillness we've been pouring into the world. The next story is called The Shadow That Bowed First. In a mountain temple where the sun rose slowly behind thick clouds, there lived an old Zen master named Eijo. He was known for his humility, his kindness, and the way he bowed to everyone and everything. Whether greeting a monk, a falling leaf, or a broken teacup, he always bowed first, with deep sincerity. One morning during winter zazen, a young monk noticed something unusual. As the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, it cast long, golden shadows across the meditation hall. The young monk, sitting near the far wall, looked up and saw the master enter. As Eijo stepped into the light, his shadow stretched across the floor. Then something happened. Before Eijo himself bowed, his shadow did. It moved, first falling forward across the wooden floor, dipping into a bow a moment before the master's own body followed. The hall was completely silent, but the young monk felt as if thunder had cracked inside his chest. His breath caught. A single tear rolled down his cheek. It was such a small thing, just a shadow, but it felt like the universe folding inward. After the meditation ended, he approached Eijo in private. "Master," he said, voice trembling, "your shadow bowed before you. What does it mean?" Eijo looked at him with eyes that had seen many seasons and replied, "It means even what is not real knows how to show respect. The question is, do you?" The monk stood in stunned silence. Eijo gently placed a hand on his shoulder. The ego waits to be acknowledged before it bows, but the soul, like the shadow, bows first. From that day on, the monk noticed shadows everywhere. The way they moved before the body, the way they mirrored without resistance, the way they lived quietly, unseen, yet always present. And in them, he found a silent teacher-own who reminded him that true reverence doesn't wait. It gives without needing to be seen. Moral of the story: humility doesn't follow recognition, it comes before it. When we bow first, we surrender the need to be above or ahead. Like the shadow that bowed before the master, true respect arises not from being seen, but from seeing deeply. In honoring others, we dissolve the self. And in that moment, something sacred returns. The next story is called The Wooden Fish That Cried During Chanting. In a modest Zen monastery near the sea, there hung a large wooden fish, Drummo carved from a single block of cedar. Every morning before sunrise, a monk would strike it with a padded mallet, calling the Sangha to the meditation hall. Its hollow, echoing sound rang through the temple like a heartbeat, steady, clear, unchanging. The fish had been there for over 100 years. It bore the wear of generations, grooves smoothed by time, its carved scales faded by light and touch. No one questioned its presence. No one gave it thought. It simply did what it was meant to do. But one morning, as the monks gathered for dawn chanting, something strange happened. As the leader began the Heart Sutra, a single drop of water fell from the fish's mouth, then another, a soft, slow dripping as if the wooden fish were weeping. At first, the monks thought it must be a leak in the roof, but when they looked up, there were no holes, no rain, no condensation. The room was dry, and yet the drops continued falling gently from the wooden fish's mouth to the floor below, forming a tiny pool on the polished wood. The chanting slowed, breath caught in throats. Even the abbot turned to look. No one spoke. The old monk who cared for the mokujo stepped forward. With a steady hand, he touched the wooden fish. Then he bowed. He turned to the Sangha and said, "For years, we've struck this instrument to keep time, to hold rhythm, to wake the world. But today, it reminds us that even those who hold space for others may carry a quiet sorrow." The chanting resumed, but softer now, each voice more tender, as if to comfort the weeping drum that had held their voices for so long. The drops stopped by morning's end, and they never returned. But from that day forward, the monks bowed to the wooden fish before and after every chant, not as an object, but as a companion. Moral of the story: even those who seem strong, steady, and silent may carry unseen sorrow. We often forget the ones who hold space for us, who keep rhythm for others while hiding their own pain. Like the wooden fish that cried during chanting, stillness is not the absence of feeling it, is the grace of holding it all, even in silence. The next story is called The Zen Master's Last Breath Was a Joke. In a peaceful Zen temple surrounded by mountains and pines, Master Haku was known for two things: his fierce clarity and his unpredictable sense of humor. He could silence a crowded room with a single glance and then make everyone laugh with the strange sound of a chicken or a story about a fish giving Dharma talks. He taught that enlightenment was serious, but the self? Never. As the years passed, his students watched his body begin to weaken. He moved more slowly, his voice softened, and yet his eyes remained sharp like still water with a deep current. Word quietly spread that his end was near. One morning, the monks gathered in the meditation hall, summoned without explanation. They sat in silence as Master Haku was carried in and propped gently on his cushion. His breathing was shallow. His hands rested quietly in his lap. A hush fell over the room. Everyone expected his final words. Maybe he would share a final koan, a teaching, a blessing, something for them to hold after he was gone. Instead, he opened one eye, looked around the room, and said in a whisper, "Don't take life so seriously. Not even death gets out alive. And then he laughed. Not a weak laugh, but a full, bright burst of joy that filled the hall like a bell ringing. His whole face lit up, and even some of the monks couldn't help but smile through their tears. And just as the last breath left his body, it sounded like a chucklier, soft exhale that carried no fear. The room stayed silent long after he was gone. Later, one student said, "He didn't teach us how to die. He taught us how to live even in his dying." They buried him under the old pine tree. On the stone above his grave, they etched only 3 words: "Still laughing now." Moral of the story: awakening doesn't have to look solemn or grand. Sometimes it sounds like a laugh at the end of a long silence. Like Master Haku, we find freedom not by clinging to meaning but by releasing the need for it. When we see through the illusion of self, even death becomes part of the joke, and the joke is beautiful. The next story is called The Brushstroke That Erased Karma. In a small Zen art hall beside a mountain stream, there lived a reclusive monk named Kensho. He rarely spoke, rarely taught, and rarely left the temple. But once each spring, he would emerge from his silent practice to paint one single piece of calligraphy. Just one. No corrections, no drafts. One brush stroke, then done. Pilgrims traveled from far villages and cities to watch. His scrolls were not ordinary. They had a presence that made even the loudest minds go still. They didn't just carry ink. They carried something unspoken, like the breath between 2 thoughts. Some said his paintings healed sadness. Others believed they revealed past lives. One year, a troubled woman came to the temple. Her face was lined not with age, but with guilt. She had abandoned her family long ago in a moment of fear and shame. Though her life had since changed, she felt chained by her past. She knelt before Kensho and whispered, "I don't seek forgiveness. I just want to understand if karma can ever be undone." Kensho didn't answer. He simply walked to his brush. The room fell silent. He picked up the brush, dipped it slowly in black ink, and then without hesitation moved his arm in one smooth, flowing stroke. A single mark across the paper. Then he stopped. No word, no symbol. Just a graceful curve like a bird in flight, vanishing into white space. He handed the scroll to the woman. She stared at it, confused. "What does it say?" she asked. Kensho looked into her eyes, gently placed a finger over her heart, and said only one word: "Now." She began to weep, not out of sorrow, but release. In that single brushstroke, she saw not her past, not her failures, but the space that still remained. A new line, a new breath. The moment where karma ends and presence begins. She carried the scroll home and hung it in silence, letting it speak louder than anything she could explain. Moral of the story: karma is not a prison. It is a pathone that can shift with even a single breath of awareness. Like the brushstroke that erased the weight of the past, true transformation doesn't come from punishment, but from presence. What we do now is the gate, and we are always holding the key. The next story is called The Lantern Lit by Mindfulness. In a misty village where the roads wound like rivers and fog lingered long after sunrise, there was a small temple with no bell, no gold, and no shrine, only a single paper lantern that hung outside the entrance, swaying gently in the wind. It was said that this lantern had never gone out, not in over 50 years. Even through storms, harsh winters, and the quiet decay of time, it remained lit. Travelers and pilgrims spoke of it in hushed tones. Some believed it was a miracle. Others said it was simply luck. But inside the temple lived an old monk named Roshi Ten, whose secret was neither miracle nor chance, it was mindfulness. Every evening at dusk, just as the sun dipped beneath the hills, Roshi Ten would walk to the lantern, kneel beside it, and tend the flame. He did not rush. He did not daydream. Each movement, opening the glass, checking the wick, adjusting the oil, was done with full attention. No thought of tomorrow, no memory of yesterday. Just the flame, the breath, the now. One night, a young monk asked him, "Master, how has the flame never gone out?" Roshi Ten smiled and replied, "Because I never let it drift into habit." The young monk nodded, but didn't fully understand. So Roshi Ten invited him to join the ritual. At first, the young monk treated it as a task, something to complete, like sweeping or washing bowls. But over time, as he slowed down and followed Roshi Ten's rhythm, he began to feel something shift. The flicker of the flame became more than just light, it became a teacher. When he was distracted, the flame danced too wildly. When he was calm, it held steady. When his thoughts wandered, the wick would smoke. And when he was fully present, the glow felt timeless. Years later, when Roshi Ten passed away quietly in his sleep, the young mono, older himself, took over the ritual. He lit the lantern each evening, not to keep a tradition alive, but to remember what had always been true. The light burns only as long as we are awake enough to tend it. Moral of the story: mindfulness is not about doing more, it's about being more present in what we already do. Like the lantern lit by care, our awareness keeps the light of life steady. When we show up fully, even for simple acts, we keep something sacred alive, no just in the world, but within ourselves. The next story is called The Prisoner Who Became Abbot. In the southern region of China, beyond the walls of a vast and ancient prison, there lived a man named Wei. He had been sentenced for crimes he committed in his youth, acts of violence fueled by fear, hunger, and anger. By the time he entered the prison gates, he was already full of regret, but it was too late. The world had closed its doors on him. One day, during a storm, the prison roof began to leak, and Wei was sent to help patch it. As he worked, he found a small book soaked in rainwater, wedged between broken tiles. The title barely readable, The Teachings of Bodhidharma. He opened it and read a line that stopped his breath. "To seek nothing is to find everything." He didn't understand it, but he felt it. Something stirred inside. From that day forward, he read what little he could, copied sutras by hand, and sat silently in the corner of his cell while others cursed or slept. At first, the guards mocked him. Other inmates laughed. But Wei remained still. He did not preach. He did not argue. He only sat. He only bowed. Years passed. His silence became contagious. Other prisoners began joining him, not out of belief, but curiosity. He showed them how to breathe, how to watch their thoughts, how to be still. The prison, once loud and bitter, grew quieter. One day, a monk from a nearby monastery came to offer teachings to the inmates. But when he entered the meditation hall, he stopped in awe. There was no disorder, no shouting. Just rows of prisoners sitting in deep stillness. At the center sat Wei, his posture straight, his face gentle, his presence calm as a mountain lake. After his release, Wei walked to the monastery gate in silence. The abbot came to greet him. "We have waited for you," he said, bowing low. Years later, when the old abbot passed away, the monks gathered and named Wei as their next teacher, not because of his past, but because of how he had met it, with humility, with stillness, with unwavering presence. Moral of the story: our past does not decide our future, our presence does. Even in the darkest place, the seed of awakening can take root. Like the prisoner who became abbot, we are not defined by what we have done, but by what we choose to become in this moment. Redemption is not given, it is lived. The next story is called The Sneeze That Interrupted Enlightenment. In a revered Zen monastery perched high above the clouds, a great moment was about to unfold. After decades of disciplined practice, deep meditation, and silent retreats, a monk named Haru sat alone in the inner hall. His master had just whispered, "You are ready." And so Haru had entered his final zazen-sated meditation, where he would pass beyond thought, beyond ego, beyond all illusion. The temple was completely still. The candle beside him did not flicker. Even the wind outside seemed to pause in respect. Haru's breath slowed. His mind became clear, wide, empty. Time seemed to stop, and then a loud sneeze. Sharp, sudden, and echoing like thunder through the wooden walls. It came from a young novice who had been quietly sweeping outside the door. The sound shattered the silence like a stone thrown into a still pond. Haru's eyes snapped open, his breath caught. The stillness broke. The novice froze, horrified, face pale with guilt. He dropped his broom and fell to his knees, bowing low. "Forgive me," he cried. "I've ruined everything." Haru stared at him, the silence between them stretching like a taut string. Then Haru laughed. Not a polite laugh, but a loud, free, belly-deep laugh that startled the birds from the rooftop. Tears filled his eyes. His laughter rang like a bell, echoing through the monastery halls. The novice looked up, confused. Haru wiped his face and said, "You didn't ruin enlightenment, you revealed it." He stood, bowed deeply to the young novice, and said, "The moment I was chasing was right here, all along, loud, messy, perfect." And with that, he walked out of the meditation hall into the sunlight, freer than he had ever been. Later, he told the other monks, "It wasn't silence that awakened me. It was the sneeze that reminded me life doesn't wait for stillness to be beautiful." Moral of the story: enlightenment isn't fragile. It doesn't vanish with noise or imperfection. It lives in the realness of each moment, breath, sound, laughter, even interruption. Like the sneeze that startled a monk awake, sometimes the very thing we think breaks the path becomes the path. Presence is not about controlling life, it's about embracing it as it is. The next story is called The Koan That Killed a Demon. In a forest temple thick with fog and old legends, there was a story whispered only during late-night sittings. Not one found in sutras or scrolls, but passed from teacher to student like a candle lighting another flame. It was the tale of a demon and a single koan that silenced it forever. Long ago, a young monk named Daigo arrived at the temple after wandering for many weeks. He was gaunt, quiet, and carried a heavy look in his eyes. He bowed low to the abbot and said, "I came not for enlightenment, but because something is following me." The monks laughed gently, thinking he was only speaking of guilt or memory. But that night, when Daigo sat for zazen in the candle-lit hall, the air grew cold. Shadows deepened, and then it came. A dark figure, formless and pulsing, appeared at the edge of the room. Its presence brought with it a crushing weight, grief, fear, rage, shame. The monks could not move. Some collapsed. But Daigo sat still, his breath steady, his gaze unmoving. The demon crept closer, whispering every cruelty it could. "You are unworthy. You will fail. You are broken beyond repair." Daigo did not answer with words. Instead, he whispered the koan his first teacher had once given him, his only one. "What was your original face before your parents were born?" The demon recoiled. He asked again, louder this time, staring directly into the shifting blackness. "What was your original face before your parents were born?" The demon screamed not from pain, but from recognition. It began to flicker, its form unraveling, as if the question pierced through layers it could no longer hold. Daigo kept asking not to attack, not to defend, but to reveal. Finally, the demon collapsed into nothing. Not destroyed, not banished, simply gone, dissolved like mist in morning light. The next morning, the monks found Daigo sitting peacefully, his eyes open, his hands still in gasho. No words were spoken, none were needed. The room where the demon fell became the new meditation hall. Moral of the story: darkness cannot survive in the light of true inquiry. The demons we face, fear, doubt, shame, feed on our silence, not our stillness. But when we turn toward them with awareness, with questions that pierce illusion, they cannot hold form. Like the koan that killed a demon, wisdom does not fight evil, it reveals its emptiness. The next story is called The Garden Path That Reappeared Only at Dawn. At a temple hidden deep within a mist-covered valley, there was a garden like no other. It was not grand or filled with rare flowers, just moss-covered stones, smooth river pebbles, and a winding path said to be centuries old. But there was something strange about this path. It could only be seen at dawn. During the day, the path would vanish. The stones seemed to scatter, the way forward blurred by shifting light and overgrown grass. Many believed it was a myth, an illusion told to keep visitors curious. But the monks knew better. Every morning before sunrise, they would rise in silence and walk it barefoot slowly, step by step, as the path emerged from the shadows, like a memory returning. The youngest monk, Riku, was fascinated by it. He asked the abbot, "Why does the path disappear? Shouldn't a true path remain visible, always?" The abbot only smiled and said, "Some paths appear only when we are still enough to see them." So Riku began rising earlier, sitting near the garden while the stars still hung in the sky. He would wait without moving, his breath slow, his eyes soft. At first, he saw nothing, just darkness and dew. But one morning, just as the light began to shift, he saw the faintest shimmer, a line of stones, barely there, like a whisper across the earth. He stood and took one step, then another. The path did not light up all at once. It revealed itself with each step he took, stone by stone, like the world saying, "Trust me." The farther he walked, the clearer it became. Not because the path had changed, but because he had. Riku returned every morning after that, not to find the path, but to find himself. The path was never captured in drawings. No one wrote down its shape. It was something you had to feel, to walk with faith, to meet in stillness when the world was quiet and the heart was open. Moral of the story: not all guidance comes at once. Sometimes the way only reveals itself in stillness, in darkness, in moments when we are willing to slow down and listen. Like the garden path that reappeared only at dawn, truth often waits for us, not in the light of certainty, but in the quiet of trust. The next story is called The Scroll That Disappeared When Read Aloud. In a mist-covered Zen temple perched atop a mountain ridge, there was a sacred library known to hold some of the rarest texts in the Buddhist world. Most were weathered, written in ancient ink and wrapped in silk, passed down through generations of monks. Among them, there was one scroll that was never studied, only whispered about. It was called The Voice of Emptiness. Wrapped in black cloth and sealed in a stone box, the scroll was said to contain a single teaching so pure, so direct, that it had never been copied. The monks believed it held the essence of awakening, not in metaphor, not in philosophy, but in direct experience. And yet, no one had ever finished reading it, because the moment it was read aloud, it vanished. Some thought it was myth, others were too reverent to try. But one day, a young monk named June, full of sincere longing and unshakable curiosity, was granted permission to open the scroll. He waited until dawn. Alone in the main hall, candle flickering beside him, he untied the black cloth with trembling hands and unrolled the scroll with care. His breath slowed. The characters shimmered, elegant and fluid, like they were still being written. He began to read aloud. The first line echoed through the room. "This is the teaching beyond teachings." He read the second line. The ink began to fade. By the third, the letters were dissolving like smoke. By the fourth, they were gone. Panicked, He reached for more light, rubbed his eyes, even turned the scroll over, blank, as if the words had never existed. Only the texture of the paper remained, warm beneath his fingers. He fell to his knees and wept. But in the silence that followed, something shifted. His thoughts stopped. His breath deepened. He wasn't grasping anymore. The teaching was no longer on the scroll, it was within him. The words, now gone, had pointed to something wordless, something still and vast, and unmistakably alive. He bowed to the empty scroll, now more sacred than ever. Moral of the story: some truths are not meant to be held, they are meant to vanish, to make room for direct knowing. The deepest wisdom does not live in words, but in the space they open. Like the scroll that disappeared when read aloud, the path is not found through knowledge, but through letting go. When we stop clinging to teachings, we become the teaching itself. The next story is called The Monk Who Spoke in Bell Chimes. In a remote monastery by the edge of a wide, quiet lake, there lived a monk who never used words. Not once in his many years of practice did he utter a sentence, a greeting, or even a chant. He was not silent out of vow or injury. He simply chose another language, the sound of the temple bell. His name was Shunyo, which meant emptiness filled with light. Every morning before sunrise, he would walk to the great bronze bell in the courtyard. With eyes closed and breath steady, he would strike it with the wooden mallet. One chime, then silence, then two, then silence again, sometimes soft, sometimes loud, always intentional. The bell rang not by habit, but as speech. At first, the other monks thought it was a ritual, but soon they began to hear more. His chimes marked not just the time, but feeling. Some mornings the bell sang with joy, high and playful. Other times it was low and long, like a sigh stretched across the sky. On stormy nights, when fear crept into the hearts of even the oldest monks, a single, steady chime would rise through the thunder, calming the darkness like a hand on the shoulder. New novices often didn't understand. One even asked the abbot, "Why doesn't he speak?" The abbot replied, "He does. You just haven't learned how to listen." One winter morning, when a beloved elder passed away, the monastery fell into heavy silence. No words could carry the grief. But Shunyo walked to the bell and struck it 7 times slow, reverent, each chime spaced by the length of a single breath. As the final sound faded into the snow, the monks wept not because of sadness alone, but because something deep within them had been touched without language. Years later, when Shunyo's own time came, he left no written teachings, only a small note beside the bell. When the mind is quiet, the sound will speak. Moral of the story: not all wisdom is spoken aloud. Some truths ring clearer in silence. Like the monk who spoke in bell chimes, we too can learn to communicate through presence, tone, and intention. In a world full of noise, sometimes the deepest understanding comes not from talking, but from truly listening. The next story is called The Breath of the Unborn Child. In a small temple surrounded by wildflowers and whispering winds, a Zen master named Kiko lived alone. He had once been the abbot of a great monastery, known far and wide for his teachings. But after the loss of his wife and their unborn child many years ago, he had quietly disappeared into solitude, seeking not answers, but stillness. He never spoke of the past. He lived simply tending the garden, sweeping the paths, offering tea to travelers. His face was gentle, his movements slow, as if listening to something few could hear. One spring afternoon, a young woman arrived at the temple, her eyes red from weeping. She was with child and alone, her heart heavy with fear. She bowed low and asked the master, "I am carrying life, but I feel lost. How do I care for a soul I cannot see when I do not even understand my own?" Master Kiko did not answer at first. He led her to the garden where the wind danced between blossoms. He handed her a cup of warm tea and gestured for her to sit. Then he spoke softly. "Do you hear that?" She closed her eyes. There was no sound, only the faint hush of wind and her own breath. "I don't hear anything," she whispered. Kiko nodded. "That is the breath of the unborn. It is the space before sound, the presence before name. It is life not yet shaped, not yet spoken, but it is here." He placed a hand gently over her belly and said, "This child is already teaching you to listen, to slow down, to meet each moment, not with control but with care." Tears rolled down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from recognition. Before she left, the master handed her a small folded cloth. Inside was a single line of calligraphy. "Breathe as if you are already two." Years later, the woman returned, this time with a child by her side. She found the temple unchanged, though Master Kiko had long since passed. The wind still moved through the wildflowers. The silence still spoke. Moral of the story: some teachings arrive before words. Some wisdom begins before life is even born. Like the breath of the unborn child, presence does not wait for form, it is already here. In learning to listen to what cannot be seen, we begin to care for what truly matters, the silent, sacred rhythm beneath all things. The next story is called The Startup CEO Who Practiced Zazen in Code. In a towering glass office in the heart of a fast-moving city, a young startup CEO named Kaito sat alone at his desk. Outside his window, the world pulsed with urgency: meetings, deadlines, traffic, ambition. But inside he sat in stillness, eyes open, screen glowing, fingers poised above the keyboard. Not typing, just breathing. Kaito had built his company from nothing. Investors admired his vision. His team called him relentless. But no one knew his secret. Every day at 4:00 a.m., before the city woke, before the inbox filled, Kaito sat in front of his laptop and practiced Zazen with a cushion, but through code. He didn't write to produce, he wrote to dissolve. He would open a blank file, place his hands gently on the keyboard, and wait not for ideas, but for presence. One line at a time, he wrote code as if drawing calligraphy, each function shaped with intention, each loop flowing like breath. If his mind wandered, he erased it. If his ego crept in, he stopped. Only when he returned to the still, wordless place within did he begin again. People asked him why his products felt so different, why they worked simply, softly, almost like they were listening. Kaito only smiled and said, "I didn't design them. I listened to what was already there." One day, after a long investor meeting filled with numbers and noise, a junior developer sat beside him and asked, "How do you stay so calm in this chaos?" Kaito turned his screen, showing nothing but a blinking cursor and a single comment in the code: "Sit, observe, then type." The developer laughed at first, then fell quiet. Kaito never advertised his practice. He didn't speak in Zen phrases, but everything he touched, his designs, his leadership, even the silence between his words, carried the stillness of early morning code. It wasn't meditation in the traditional sense. It was Zazen, hidden in syntax, in spaces, in discipline. Moral of the story: stillness isn't limited to temples or cushions. It lives wherever we bring full presence. Like the CEO who practiced Zazen in code, mindfulness can be found in what we create when we stop trying to impress and start trying to be true. When work becomes awareness, even a blinking cursor becomes a bell. The next story is called The Ghost That Attended Dharma Talks. In the heart of a misty forest stood a weathered temple, old enough that no one remembered its original builders. The monks who lived there followed a rhythm of quiet study and deep meditation. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, they gathered for a Dharma talk in the wooden hall, candles lit, incense rising, voices soft and measured. One night, during a talk on attachment and the illusion of self, a monk paused mid-sentence. His gaze lingered at the back of the room, near the door. "I thought I saw someone," he whispered. The others turned, but there was no one there. Just shadows, just stillness. They continued. But it happened again the next night, and again, always during the Dharma talks, always near the back wall. A chill would settle in the room, just briefly. The air grew heavy, but not hostile. Some monks began to leave an extra cushion open, just in case. Eventually, the abbot spoke gently to the Sangha. "Not all seekers have bodies. Some truths are heard by those who never had the chance to let go." He explained that many years ago, before the temple was restored, a man had come here seeking refuge. Worn down by guilt and sorrow, he had died on the steps before ever entering. The monks of that time buried him with compassion, but his longing had lingered. And now, perhaps drawn by the words, or by the silence between them, he had returned. So the monks welcomed him. They left offerings of incense where the shadows gathered. They bowed not just to the living, but to what could not be seen. And each night, when the teachings were shared, they imagined a presence just beyond their eyes, listening. One day, the chill stopped. The cushion remained empty. The incense no longer burned down with a strange curve. But the monks continued to leave space, not out of habit, but out of respect. Moral of the story: not all who seek truth wear faces we can see. Some carry longing across lifetimes, drawn not to temples, but to sincerity. Like the ghost that attended Dharma talks, even the unseen long for peace. When we open our hearts to all beings visible, and not, we discover that compassion has no borders, and awakening is not reserved for the living alone. The next story is called "The Text Message That Became a Sutra." In the heart of a crowded city, filled with flashing lights and endless scrolling, lived a college student named Meena. Her days were fast, full of noisy lectures, group chats, music in her ears, and thoughts that never stopped moving. She felt tired, but didn't know why, restless, but couldn't explain it. Even when alone, her mind buzzed like a phone that never stopped vibrating. One evening, while riding the subway home, she received a message from her grandmother, just a short line of text. "Breathe once, without needing anything." That was all. No emojis, no explanation, no follow-up. At first, Meena blinked at it, unsure what to make of it. She almost laughed, but something about the message made her pause. She looked up from her screen, noticed the way her shoulders were tense, her jaw tight, her thoughts racing nowhere. So, for the first time in weeks, she put her phone down, closed her eyes, and took a single breath. Not to calm down, not to do it right, just to breathe. The train kept moving, people kept talking, the city stayed loud, but something inside her stilled, just for a second. That night, she couldn't stop thinking about the message. She wrote it on a sticky note and placed it above her bed, then above her desk, then on the mirror. Over time, it became her quiet practice. Every time she saw it, she would stop and take that one breath again without needing anything to change. Months passed. She started sharing the line with others, friends in stress, strangers on message boards, even on her social media. One day, her professor, a scholar of Buddhist philosophy, saw it printed on her notebook and asked where it came from. Meena smiled and said, "It's from my grandma." The professor paused and whispered, "It's the Heart Sutra," in a single sentence. Meena never called herself a teacher, but people began saying her message had changed them, made them feel human again, just for a moment. Moral of the story: wisdom doesn't always arrive wrapped in ancient scrolls. Sometimes it comes in a single message, quiet, simple, and true. Like the text that became a sutra, a few honest words, offered with love, can open the space between thoughts. And in that space, we remember, one breath is enough. The next story is called The Drone That Circled the Bodhi Tree. In modern-day India, near the sacred site of Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha once sat beneath the Bodhi tree and awakened to the truth of all things, a new kind of visitor arrived not on foot, but through the sky. It was a small drone. Sleek, buzzing, and silver in the sun, it hovered above the ancient tree, spinning slowly in circles, its tiny camera eye fixed on the quiet ground below. Pilgrims shaded their eyes to watch. Monks raised their brows, then returned to their chants. The drone made no sound but a soft hum, almost like a mechanical mantra. The man controlling it stood a few meters away, dressed in jeans and a windbreaker, phone in hand, face unreadable. He wasn't a monk. He wasn't even sure why he had come. His life back home was busy, noisy, full of screens and deadlines. Something in him had broken open months earlier. Sudden loss, a moment of panic, a silence he couldn't ignore. So he came, not to bow, just to see. And the only way he knew how to see was through a lens. For hours, he circled the Bodhi tree with the drone, taking hundreds of images. But no matter the angle, the light, or the height, he felt nothing. The tree was just a tree. As evening came, he sat on a bench nearby, watching the monks in orange robes walk barefoot across the courtyard. One elderly monk sat quietly beneath the tree, unmoving, his eyes half closed, lips gently parted as if whispering to the leaves. Without thinking, the man set down the drone controller and watched with his own eyes. The tree seemed to shift, not in shape, but in presence. It wasn't just old, it was still, rooted, silent, vast. He looked down at the drone, now still on the ground, then back at the tree. He walked forward, slowly, and for the first time that day, he bowed, not to capture, but to release. Moral of the story: we often try to see truth from above, through devices, through distance, through filters, but the path to awakening doesn't circle the truth, it sits beneath it. Like the drone that circled the Bodhi tree, our search must descend into presence. When we finally look without needing to capture, we begin to receive, and that is where seeing truly begins. The next story is called The Wall Street Trader Who Found Satori in a Flash Crash. In a towering glass building overlooking the roar of New York City, a man named Vincent lived a life built on speed. He was a Wall Street trader, sharp, precise, always watching the numbers race across his screens like fireflies on caffeine. He spoke in profits, thought in forecasts, and breathed in seconds. The market was his religion, his heartbeat, his identity. But inside, something was unraveling. Each day left him more hollow. Victories felt thin, losses cut too deep. He had everything, and yet he woke every morning with the same quiet ache. Is this it? Then came the flash crash. It was a morning like any other until the numbers collapsed without warning. Stocks fell like dominoes. The screens glowed red. Traders around him shouted. Phones rang off the hook. Panic surged through the air like electricity. Vincent's fingers froze above the keyboard. His heart pounded. And then he stopped. Time, for him, slowed. In that one impossible moment, while the world around him scrambled, Vincent sat still. Everything fell away. The shouts, the fear, the obsession with gain. The need to control vanished. And in that instant of total collapse, something strange and quiet bloomed in his chest. He saw the market for what it truly was: impermanent, shifting, without anchor. And in seeing it, he saw himself. the same flicker, the same rise and fall, the same illusion of control. He smiled, not out of madness, but out of clarity. For the first time in his life, he felt free. When the market stabilized hours later, Vincent didn't return to his desk. He walked out of the building, left his badge on the security desk, and disappeared from the world he had once ruled. Months later, he was spotted working at a small Zen retreat in upstate New York, sweeping floors, serving tea, sitting in silence. When asked if he missed his old life, he simply replied, "No bell rings twice." Moral of the story: sometimes awakening comes not through stillness, but collapse. When the structures we cling to fall apart, space opens for truth. Like the trader who found Satori in a flash crash, we may only see clearly when the illusion breaks. In the ruins of control, peace waits quiet, unexpected, and completely real. The next story is called The Librarian Who Filed Karma. In the heart of a sprawling monastery nestled between quiet rice fields, there was a library older than any of the monks who walked its halls. Scrolls and sutras lined the wooden shelves, some fragile, some never opened, others copied by hand 100 times. And deep within this quiet world of paper and dust worked an old librarian named Mayo. He was not a monk, though he wore robes. He had never taken vows, though he followed the rhythm of temple life. For 50 years, he had tended the library without ever giving a Dharma talk, ringing a bell, or sitting on the teacher's cushion. But the monks respected him more than many who taught with words. Because Mayo did something no one else could do. He remembered every action, every book moved, every scroll borrowed, every ink mark added, not just on the shelves, but in the hearts of those who read them. He kept no written records, but somehow he knew. One young monk once asked, "Why do you work here every day? You never teach, you never preach." Mayo smiled softly and replied, "I file karma." The monk blinked in confusion. "You mean you keep track of our pasts?" "No," said Mayo, "I keep track of how present you are and where it leads." When the monks read a sutra out of obligation, Mayo would quietly reshelve it somewhere harder to find. But when they read with awe, with stillness, with genuine longing, that scroll would somehow reappear open, waiting, as if it had chosen them in return. One day, the abbot passed away, and the Sangha gathered to name a successor. To everyone's surprise, they chose Mayo. He bowed and declined. "I do not lead," he said. "I only witness. I do not carry karma, I simply return it to its rightful shelf." And then he returned to the stacks, brushing dust from an old copy of the Diamond Sutra, placing it gently into the hands of a trembling novice who hadn't even asked for it aloud. Moral of the story: every thought, every breath, every choice we make writes a page in our unseen book. Karma is not punishment, it is memory. And those who live with presence, like the librarian who filed karma, know that what we read in life is always shaped by how we hold it. The lessons we're ready for will always find us when we are ready to be found. The next story is called The Rain Cloud That Understood Rebirth. High above a quiet valley, a single rain cloud drifted in silence. It had no name, no voice, no destination, only a soft heaviness, full of water and waiting. The sky stretched endlessly around it. The wind moved gently beneath it, but still, the cloud lingered. It had once been a river. Long ago, it had flowed through forests and fields, over rocks and under bridges. It had sparkled in sunlight, rushed through narrow bends, cradled children's feet, and carried fallen leaves. But like all things, it was drawn upward, evaporated by time and heat and change. Now it floated, uncertain and alone, above the earth it once knew. At first, the cloud mourned what it had lost. "I used to move," it whispered to the sky. "I used to be part of something." but the sky only smiled, vast and still. Below, the world carried on. The riverbed was dry. Trees stretched toward the sky, roots aching for moisture. A lone farmer looked up, sun-worn and weary, and closed his eyes in prayer. And then, the cloud began to weep, not out of sorrow, but surrender. Drop by drop, it released itself, falling through air with grace, becoming mist, then rain, then life again. Some drops landed on the farmer's hands, some sank into the soil, some ran along the cracks of the old riverbed, others kissed the leaves of trees that hadn't bloomed in weeks. The cloud felt no fear as it disappeared, because it hadn't ended, it had returned. In the laughter of children dancing in puddles, in the steam rising from tea, in the quiet of roots drinking deeply beneath the earth, it had become everything it ever was and more. No longer bound by shape, no longer clinging to what had passed. Just water, just life, just this. Moral of the story: nothing truly ends. Everything simply changes form. Like the rain cloud that understood rebirth, we too are part of a greater cyclerizing, falling, returning. When we stop resisting change, we begin to see that loss is not the opposite of life, but part of its unfolding. And in letting go, we don't disappear, we come home. The next story is called The Quantum Physicist Who Saw Emptiness in Equations. In a quiet lab tucked beneath the lecture halls of a famous university, a physicist named Dr. Anika Rao spent her days exploring the tiniest building blocks of the universe. She was brilliant, published, praised, surrounded by chalkboards filled with symbols the average person couldn't read. Yet the deeper she went into the quantum world, the more restless she became. Particles vanished when observed. Waves behaved like matter. Nothing was fixed. Nothing was certain. One evening, long after her colleagues had gone home, she sat alone in her office, staring at the same line of equations she had written and erased for weeks. She rubbed her tired eyes, looked at the chalk in her hand, and whispered, "Why does the math feel like it's chasing shadows?" Just then, a soft knock came at the door. It was a visiting monk from a nearby Zen center, invited earlier to give a talk on mindfulness in science. Dr. Rao had skipped the talk, but the monk had not skipped her. He saw the mess of chalk, the stacks of books, and the fatigue on her face. "You're looking for what cannot be caught," he said gently, like trying to hold water in a net. She looked up, a bit defensive. "I'm looking for truth, proof, structure, reality." He nodded. "And all your equations? They point to what?" She paused. "To uncertainty, to probability, to potential." The monk smiled. "To emptiness." Something inside her stilled. In the days that followed, Dr. Rao began to study not only quantum mechanics, but the Heart Sutra. She read of form is emptiness, emptiness is form, and felt a strange recognition. The particles she tracked did not exist as fixed things, but as possibilities, unfolding only when met with attention, just like thoughts, just like breath, just like self. Years later, she began her lectures not with numbers but with a bow. To the bored, to the mystery, to the space between the answers. Moral of the story: science and spirit are not rivals, they are mirrors. Both seek what cannot be touched, only known. Like the physicist who saw emptiness in equations, we come closer to truth not by solving the universe, but by dissolving into it. The more deeply we look, the more we find nothing solidly awareness, rising and passing like a wave in a field that was never truly separate. The next story is called The Theravada Shadow in a Mahayana Room. In a quiet Zen monastery nestled among cedar trees, deep in the mountains of Japan, a visiting monk arrived from Sri Lanka. He was from the Theravada tradition, humble, precise, wrapped in saffron robes, and quiet as falling snow. The Mahayana monks welcomed him with respectful bows, but wondered what he might think of their ways of chanting to bodhisattvas, of koans, of tea served as ceremony, of silence turned into sound. He did not say much. He bowed deeply. He watched everything. He smiled often. Each morning, while the Mahayana monks entered the zendo for seated meditation, the Theravada monk remained outside under the old pine, walking slowly in mindful circles. His breath followed each step. His hands rested lightly in front of him. When the bell rang, he bowed to the door, never entering. The young monks whispered, "Why doesn't he sit with us? Does he think our way is wrong?" The abbot only said, "He is practicing. Just listen." That evening, as the sun lowered and cast golden light into the meditation hall, one of the junior monks stayed behind after zazen. He watched the shadow on the wall, the long outline of the Theravada monk outside, walking. Step, breath, step, breath. No voice, no noise, just presence. The shadow moved like a prayer. The young monk felt something shift. He suddenly understood that even though they practiced differently, the intention was the same. The form was different, but the devotion was shared. The Theravada monk had brought his tradition into their space not by force, not with argument, but through stillness that reached beyond words. The next morning, when the Mahayana monks sat, they left the doors slightly open. And outside, the shadow walked beside them again. No division, no debate. Just Dharma in many forms, bowing to itself. Moral of the story: truth wears many robes. Paths may differ, but awakening is one. Like the Theravada shadow in the Mahayana room, deep practice does not need to speak to be understood. When we honor presence over pride, we begin to see that the silence beneath all traditions speaks the same language: compassion, discipline, and the deep stillness of the heart. The next story is called The Samurai Who Chose Silence Over Vengeance. Long ago, in the northern provinces of Japan, there lived a skilled and feared samurai named Kazuo. His sword was swift, his honor unshakable, and his loyalty to his lord unquestioned. But one winter, during a time of betrayal and war, Kazuo's master was slain by a rival clan. The enemy fled, and Kazuo was left burning with rage. Vengeance was not only expected, it was his duty. For weeks, he tracked the assassin through snow-covered forests and mountain passes. His anger was sharp, pure, disciplined. He spoke to no one. He ate only what he could find. In his heart, he rehearsed the moment he would strike. Justice would be done, balance would be restored. At last, he found the man alone in a ruined hut near a frozen lake. Weakened, starving, and nearly blind, the killer barely recognized the blade at his throat. Kazuo raised his sword. But then, something stopped him. The man looked up not with fear, but with emptiness. Not defiance, not regret, just stillness. The snow outside was falling gently. The wind was quiet. The assassin said nothing. And Kazuo, in that moment, saw not a villain but a man whose hatred had already destroyed him. A life hollowed out by choices long made. A fire already burned to ash. He lowered his sword. The assassin collapsed in tears. But Kazuo did not console him. He simply turned and walked away, into the snow, without speaking a word. When Kazuo returned to his village, the people called him a coward. His fellow warriors shunned him. Some spat at his feet, but he did not explain. He did not argue. Instead, he removed his armor and entered a nearby monastery as a novice monk. He took a vow of silence. He traded sword for broom, vengeance for breath. Years passed. He never spoke of the man he had spared, but those who sat beside him in meditation said they felt something in his presence like a mountain that had weathered a great storm and chose peace instead of thunder. Moral of the story: True strength is not shown in striking back, it is shown in laying down the need to. Like the samurai who chose silence over vengeance, we learn that not all battles are won by force. Some are ended when we refuse to continue them. In that stillness, we do not lose honor, we return to it. The next story is called The Refugee Who Chanted in the Rubble. In a city torn apart by war, where buildings stood half-fallen and the air smelled of ash, there was a woman named Sama. She had once lived a quiet life growing herbs, raising her son, listening to birds in the morning. But war does not ask for permission. One day, her home was gone, her husband lost, her child missing in the chaos. She fled with nothing but a torn shawl and a mala of cracked wooden beads, worn thin by years of prayer. They called her a refugee. She found shelter in what remained of an old temple, its roof shattered, statues broken, the Buddha's face chipped but still looking downward in calm. Others came, two mothers, elders, children without names. They huddled in corners, hungry and afraid. Each night, the sky echoed with distant explosions and the ground trembled. But Sama sat. Every evening, as the sun disappeared behind smoke-filled clouds, she pulled her shawl tightly around her shoulders, held her mala, and began to chant. Her voice was soft, steady like wind threading through ruins. She did not chant to be heard. She did not chant to be saved. She chanted because it was the only thing left that hadn't been taken. At first, the others watched in silence. Some were annoyed. "Why chant?" one man asked. "There's nothing holy left here." Sama looked at him with gentle eyes and said, "That is why I chant." The next night, a child joined her, then an elder, then another voice, then another, until the sound of soft chanting rose like incense through broken walls. They had no roof, no food, but in the rubble their voices wove a sanctuary no one could destroy. Weeks later, aid workers arrived and found the group sitting in silence, hands joined, eyes open. One worker asked, "How did you survive this?" Sama smiled and said, "We remembered who we were when everything else was gone." Moral of the story: in the face of destruction, the soul does not need walls to stand. Like the refugee who chanted in the rubble when all is stripped away, our practice remains not as escape, but as return. In the darkest moments, the quiet strength of presence becomes a light no war can silence. The next story is called The Forest That Refused to Burn for a Meditator. In the heart of a dry and wind-swept land, there was a forest known to be ancient, silent, and wild. It was feared by villagers who believed it held restless spirits, and by woodcutters who claimed that the trees groaned when cut. Few dared enter it, fewer returned. But one day, a traveling meditator named Soma came to its edge. She was not seeking fear or challenge, only stillness. She had spent years wandering from temple to temple, searching for a place quiet enough to meet her own mind fully. And when she saw the forest dark, untamed, and untouched, bowed. She found a clearing deep within and sat beneath a crooked old tree, its bark scorched from storms long past. With no shrine, no bell, no walls, only breath and wind, she began her practice. Each day she sat. Each night she stayed. Villagers watched from afar, waiting for her to return. But weeks passed, and she did not leave. The forest, they said, would consume her. But it didn't. Instead, it grew calmer. Birds gathered near her. Foxes paused beside her mat. Even the winds, once sharp and wild, softened through the trees. Then, one dry summer afternoon, lightning struck the edge of the forest. Flames licked through the grass, trees sizzled and cracked. Smoke began to rise, but just as the fire approached the clearing where Soma sat completely still, completely present, the wind shifted. The fire split and turned, circling the grove but never entering. When the blaze had passed, the clearing remained untouched. Not a leaf was burned, not a petal had fallen. When asked later what happened, Soma only bowed and said, "I did nothing. The forest simply saw that I had no desire to harm it." Her words were not metaphor. Those who visited that clearing in the years that followed said it held a silence so deep, even fire had bowed to it. Moral of the story: nature responds to presence. When we meet the world with stillness instead of fear, harmony instead of control, something ancient remembers us. Like the forest that refused to burn for a meditator, the world around us often reflects the furor, the peace within. When the heart holds no harm, even the wild becomes gentle. The next story is called The Abbot Who Was a Woman in Secret. In a quiet monastery nestled at the base of a snow-touched mountain, the monks revered their abota-wise, calm teacher, known as Master Ryokan. He had led the temple for decades with steady hands and few words. His teachings were simple but deep, like water poured into stone. Visitors traveled far to hear his guidance. They bowed to his robes, his posture, his quiet authority. But no one knew the truth. Master Ryokan was not a man. She was a woman. Long ago, she had entered the monastic path disguised in a time and place where women were not accepted in the upper ranks of Zen. She cut her hair, bound her chest, and took vows in silence. Not to deceive, but to be allowed to practice. Her love for the Dharma burned brighter than the fear of being discovered. Over the years, she rose not by ambition, but through presence. She swept floors with reverence. She sat zazen longer than anyone. Her eyes saw through noise and ego. When the old abbot passed, she was chosen to lead not because of what she appeared to be, but because of what she had become. And so she guided with clarity and compassion, hiding nothing but her name. But secrets are heavy, even when carried in stillness. One winter, sensing her body weakening, she called her closest student and placed a worn scroll in his hands. Inside was her story told with honesty, not apology. Her name, her journey, her choice, her silence. The student trembled as he read, "Why did you never tell us?" She looked at him with the same gentle eyes that had guided him since he was a boy and said, "Because the truth was never in my body. It was in my practice." She passed before the snow melted. The monks held a memorial, no titles, no masks, just deep bows and tears. They carved a new name on her gravestone, Ryoko, the one who walked without fear. Moral of the story: truth does not live in appearances. It lives in how we show up in silence, in service, in courage. Like the abbot who was a woman in secret, real leadership is not about being seen. It is about seeing clearly and walking the path even when no one is watching. The next story is called The Plastic Bag That Floated Through Samsara. On the edge of a crowded city where buildings scraped the sky and horns never stopped echoing, a single plastic bag was lifted by the wind. It danced between cars, across sidewalks, past markets and temples, unnoticed by most. Caught in breezes, snagged in branches, dropped again, always moving, never still. No one remembered where it had come from. A grocery store, a vendor, someone's careless hand. It had long since lost its purpose. It carried nothing now, except movement. It drifted through streets, floated over rivers, tumbled into fields. It wrapped around the necks of trees, choked gutters, startled birds. Sometimes it was cursed, sometimes it was kicked. Once a child picked it up and wore it like a ghost costume. It flew from his shoulders and vanished into the sky. The bag, if it had awareness, might have wondered what it had done to be born into such aimless wandering, always being pushed, always being pulled, never asked where it wanted to go. And yet somewhere, far beyond the noise, a monk sweeping the grounds of a quiet monastery, saw the bag fluttering toward the temple gate. Instead of turning away, he stopped and watched. The bag spun, twisted, floated in circles. There was something strangely graceful in its helplessness. Like a being caught in samsara, endless cycle of rebirth and movement, pulled by unseen karma through lifetime after lifetime. The monk picked it up gently, not with disgust, but with reverence. He carried it inside and washed it, let it dry in the sun, then folded it with care and placed it inside a meditation hall. When asked by another monk why he had done such a strange thing, he said, "This bag has wandered far. May it rest now in silence." Years later, that same bag was used as a cushion cover for visiting children. It tore gently with time, releasing nothing, only air. Moral of the story: even the forgotten, the discarded, the ugly can hold the path within them. Like the plastic bag floating through samsara, we too are tossed by forces we cannot see: desire, fear, habit. But when touched by awareness, even the most restless soul can come to stillness. No life is wasted when it is seen with compassion. No journey is too messy to be part of awakening. The next story is called The Postman Who Delivered Koans. In a sleepy coastal town where the streets curled like question marks and the fog hung low in the mornings, there was a postman named Haru. He was quiet, always on time, and never rushed. People said he had delivered mail for over 40 years. Same route, same steps, same gentle nods. Children waved at him, elders waited for him. He wore the same hat every season and carried a small bag with a single bell attached. But what most people didn't know was that Haru delivered more than mail. He delivered koans, not in envelopes, not typed or sealed, but hidden in moments subtle, strange, and unforgettable. He once handed a woman a letter and said, "This one has already been opened, but it's never been read." He once knocked on a door 3 times, then walked away without leaving anything. When the man inside ran after him in confusion, Haru only smiled and said, "That's the delivery." To a boy grieving his dog, he said softly, "The bark still echoes, even when the dog is gone." No one knew where he had learned these things. Some said he had once trained at a temple, others thought he was just a little odd. But no one forgot the way his words lingered like riddles in the wind, like dreams you half remember but can't explain. One day, he handed a letter to a young artist struggling with self-doubt. As she reached for it, he looked her in the eyes and said, "If a painting is never finished, is it ever wrong?" She stood frozen as he walked away, the bell on his bag chiming softly in the fog. Years later, after Haru retired, the town changed. Mail still came, but it was quieter now. People missed the pauses he created, the way his presence slowed time. Some said they began to listen more closely to everyday things: the creak of a door, the rustle of leaves, the silence between words. Because somehow, even in his absence, his koans remained. Moral of the story: wisdom doesn't always arrive in temples or teachings. Sometimes it comes with a knock on the door, a glance, a sentence wrapped in mystery. Like the postman who delivered koans, the deepest truths may appear in the simplest moments, disguised as daily life, delivered when we're ready to hear them. The next story is called The Old Man Who Forgot His Name and Found Buddha. In a quiet mountain village wrapped in the hush of pine trees and slow seasons, there lived an old man named Haru, or at least that had once been his name. Over the years, his memory began to fade, first the names of neighbors, then the names of flowers, then even the name he had called himself for a lifetime. By the time he turned 80, Haru no longer remembered who he had been. He wandered the village gently, smiling at strangers, bowing to children, forgetting conversations before they ended. Some pitied him, some avoided him, but he never seemed troubled. In fact, There was a peace about him that made people pause, a quiet glow in his eyes, like he had laid something heavy down that the rest of them were still carrying. One afternoon, a traveling monk passed through the village. He saw the old man sitting beside a stream, hands folded in his lap, watching water glide over smooth stones. "Sir," the monk asked kindly, "do you live here?" The old man looked up and said, "I'm not sure." "Do you know your name?" the monk asked. The old man chuckled. "I had one once, I think, but now I'm just this." The monk sat beside him. "And what is this?" The old man pointed to the stream. "Just passing through." The monk was silent. Then he bowed deeply. Days later, he told the villagers, "That man is closer to Buddha than most who sit on cushions all day." For the rest of his life, the old man continued to forget. He forgot dates, places, even time itself. But he never forgot the stream, never forgot the sound of birds, never forgot how to smile at the wind. When he passed, no one knew the exact day. He was found sitting peacefully under a tree, eyes closed, palms open, as if in mid-conversation with something far beyond words. Moral of the story: we spend much of life trying to remember who we are, clinging to names, roles, stories, but sometimes in forgetting, we return to what's real. Like the old man who forgot his name and found Buddha, awakening isn't about knowing more, it's about needing less. When we stop asking, "Who am I?" and simply are, the answer appears without a single word. The next story is called "The Dancer Who Used Mudra Instead of Movement." In a village where music once echoed through lantern-lit courtyards, there lived a dancer named Lian. She had been famous in her youth, known for movements so graceful they made people forget time. Her hands painted air, her feet whispered across the earth, and her presence felt like a prayer. But time, as it does, moved on. An illness came, quiet and cruel. It took her strength, then her balance, and finally her legs. The doctors said she would never dance again. Friends mourned. Audiences moved on. The stage that once held her brilliance grew still. But Lian did not grieve her body. She sat in silence for many weeks, watching the wind in the trees, feeling the rise and fall of her breath. And one morning, she lifted her hands slowly, gently, and formed a mudra. It was small, barely a gesture, just two fingers curved together, a thumb resting in stillness. Yet in that simple shape, she felt something awaken. Her body no longer moved across stages, but her hands began to speak. With each mudra, she remembered rhythm, emotion, story. Her palms told of joy, her fingers bowed in sorrow. Her breath became her music. She began to sit in the center of the temple courtyard each evening, not to perform but to offer. In silence, people gathered. Children sat cross-legged, elders leaned on canes. No music played, no feet moved, but her hands moved like petals falling through light. And people wept, not because they missed the old dance, but because they saw something deeper, a soul that had not stopped moving, even when the body had. One young girl asked her, "Do you miss dancing?" Lian smiled and held her hands in prayer. "This is the dance," she said. "It always was." Moral of the story: movement is not always in motion. True expression lives in presence. Like the dancer who used mudra instead of movement, we learn that beauty does not disappear when the body's slow sit deepens. When the heart is still full, the hands remember, and even the quietest gesture can move the world. The next story is called "The Monk Who Took a Vow of Laughter." In a solemn monastery nestled high in the misty cliffs of Bhutan, silence was sacred. The monks walked in stillness, meditated in silence, and spoke only when necessary. Their discipline was respected across the land. It was said that even the wind bowed its voice when passing through the temple walls. But then came Brother Jampa. He was young, round-faced, and full of questions. His laughter, soft at first, began to bloom like spring in a room built for winter. He laughed at the birds chasing each other outside the zendo. He laughed when he spilled tea on his robes. He even laughed gently, respectfully during a particularly long Dharma talk, not out of mockery, but from the joy of how endlessly the teacher circled the same point. At first, the senior monks scolded him. "Laughter is a distraction," they said. "The path is steep and serious." But Jampa bowed and replied, "So is life, but slipping is also part of walking." The abbot watched him quietly for weeks. Then one morning, just after sunrise, he called Jampa to the meditation hall. "What do you seek in laughter?" the abbot asked. Jampa placed his hands together and said, "I seek the sound of freedom. When I laugh, I stop clinging even, if just for a breath." The abbot did not speak. Instead, he smiled. And then he laughed, a deep, quiet chuckle that seemed to shake the walls from the inside. From that day on, Jampa was not silenced. Instead, he was given a new practice: to laugh once, every day, with full awareness. He took it as a vow. He did not laugh to escape pain or to mask discomfort. He laughed like one bows, fully present, fully sincere. His laughter wasn't loud, it was warm, and it began to spread. Monks who hadn't smiled in years began to chuckle. Visitors left lighter than when they arrived. Even during funerals, Jampa's laughter, soft as wind through bamboo, reminded them, impermanence is not always sorrow. Sometimes it's a cosmic joke. Moral of the story: awakening does not always arrive on a quiet breath or a still mind. Sometimes it comes with a smile. Like the monk who took a vow of laughter, we learn that joy is not a distraction from the path, it is the path. When laughter arises from presence, not escape, it becomes a bell that rings from the heart of freedom. The next story is called The Meditation Hall That Collapsed But No One Moved. On a wind-swept mountainside, far from any road or city, there stood a Zen monastery carved into the cliffs like a whisper in stone. Its meditation hall was ancient wooden beams weathered by centuries, floors polished by countless bare feet. The monks who lived there followed a strict discipline: silence, simplicity, and unwavering presence. One spring morning, as the monks gathered for zazen, a soft rain began to fall. Inside the hall, 50 monks sat shoulder to shoulder, backs straight, eyes half closed, breaths slow and steady. The only sound was the patter of rain on the old roof and the faint rhythm of the bell. Then it happened. A deep cracking noise broke through the stillness. One of the central support beams, rotten from years of quiet decay, split in two. The roof groaned. Dust fell from the rafters. The floor trembled. And then the hall began to collapse. The walls buckled inward, beams snapped like dry branches, and the ceiling caved in. But not a single monk moved. They sat, not out of shock, not from fear, but from presence. No one screamed, no one ran. They simply remained with their breath as the roof broke open to the sky and the wind poured through the space. A falling beam narrowly missed the bell, splinters flew, the rain came down harder, and still they sat. When it was over, the meditation hall was in ruins. But beneath the open sky, the monks remained on their cushions soaked in rain, surrounded by debris, eyes open, hearts still. Later, someone from the nearby village asked, "Why didn't you run?" The abbot replied, "Where would we go? The mind was already here." In time, the hall was never rebuilt. The monks chose to sit beneath the sky from then on, rain or sun, winter or summer. And every year, more visitors come to see the ruins, but to experience the stillness that never fell. Moral of the story: true stability doesn't come from walls or roofs. It comes from the mind that does not flinch. Like the monks who sat through the collapse, we discover that when everything around us falls apart, presence remains. The world may break, but the stillness inside us does not have to. The next story is called The Fish That Reincarnated to Teach a Lesson. In a small mountain village wrapped around a crystal-clear lake, there lived an old fisherman named Daiki. He was known for his quiet way of life, his well-worn boat, and the way he spoke to the lake as if it were a friend. He fished only what he needed, never more, and always whispered a blessing before casting his net. One day, as Daiki pulled in his catch, he found a single golden fish tangled in the mesh. Its scales shimmered in the morning light, and its eyes strangely seemed to meet his with a calm awareness. He paused. Something in him stirred, though he could not name it. Gently, he freed the fish and placed it back in the water. "Go," he said softly. "This isn't your day." From that day on, the fish returned, always near his boat, always watching. It never swam away in fear, nor did it try to leap into the net. It just stayed. Each time Daiki saw it, he felt a stillness rise inside him, as though someone were reminding him of something he had forgotten. Years passed. One morning, the fish didn't appear. Daiki waited. The lake was still. That night, he dreamed of a young boy sitting cross-legged at the edge of the lake. The boy looked up and said, "Thank you for sparing me. I had one more life to live." In the dream, Daiki wept not out of sorrow, but wonder. The next day, a wandering monk arrived in the village. He sat with Daiki and spoke of rebirth, of unfinished lessons, and of how some beings return not to gain but to give. "There are bodhisattvas among fish," the monk said, smiling. "Some come to reflect our own compassion back to us." Daiki never fished again. He gave his boat to the village and spent his remaining years in quiet service, teaching children to watch the water not just for fish, but for what lives beyond the surface. Moral of the story: every encounter may hold a mirror. Every life may be a teacher in disguise. Like the fish that reincarnated to teach a lesson, we're reminded that compassion is never wasted, it ripples across lifetimes. When we act with kindness, even toward the smallest lives, we may awaken something ancient, not just in them but in ourselves. The next story is called The Tree That Grew in Reverse. In a quiet Zen garden far from the city, there stood a strange tree unlike any other. At first glance, it looked ordinary, its trunk smooth, its leaves small and soft. But there was one thing no one could explain. The tree was growing downward. Its branches did not reach for the sky. They bent toward the earth. Its roots, visible above the ground, twisted into the air like fingers searching for something unseen. The monks called it Gyakujuthe, reverse tree. It had never been planted. It simply appeared one spring after a long winter. Some thought it was a mistake of nature. Others believed it was a message. One novice named Kenta became obsessed with the tree. He sat by it every day, asking, "Why does it grow this way?" He measured its bend, traced its roots, even whispered to its leaves. After months of silent watching, he finally asked the abbot, "Why does this tree defy everything we know?" The abbot smiled gently and said, "It doesn't defy anything. It reveals something." Kenta frowned. "But shouldn't growth go upward?" The abbot pointed to the soil. "Only if you believe the goal is the sky." Kenta didn't understand until one morning after heavy rain, he noticed something. While other trees had lost branches to the wind, Gyakuju stood firm. Its roots, though upside down, had anchored it with perfect balance. Water flowed down its limbs with ease, nourishing its base. Its unusual form made it resilient, silent, strong. In its bending, it did not resist life. It surrendered to it. That day, Kenta stopped asking why and began sitting beside the tree with stillness. And soon, he too felt something shifting inside, not growing up, but deepening down. Years later, a new monk asked Kenta, "Why does that tree grow in reverse?" Kenta smiled and replied, "Because not everything that rises is wise. Some things must first grow inward." Moral of the story: growth isn't always about reaching higher. Sometimes it's about going deeper into silence, into shadow, into self. Like the tree that grew in reverse, real strength comes not from pushing upward, but from grounding ourselves in what we often overlook. The deeper the root, the steadier the life. The next story is called The Pebble That Sank with Intention. In the middle of a deep forest, far from roads and noise, there was a small, still pond that reflected the sky like a mirror. Monks from a nearby monastery often came to sit beside it, using the water's calmness to quiet their thoughts. But one monk, named Tenzin, came not just to sit but to let go. Tenzin was known for his restlessness. No matter how hard he tried, his thoughts would spiral. Doubts, regrets, plans, what-ifs. Even during zazen, his breath would hitch under the weight of stories he couldn't stop telling himself. One morning, the abbot handed him a smooth pebble and said only, "When you're ready to release what you're clinging to, take this to the pond." Tenzin held the pebble in his palm. It wasn't special, just ordinary grey stone, cool and still, but he carried it with him everywhere. For days, then weeks, in his robe, in his hand during meditation, under his pillow. It became a symbol of everything he was holding on to: guilt from the past, fear of the future, questions with no answers. One foggy dawn, he walked alone to the pond. The surface was perfectly still. He knelt, closed his eyes, and whispered not a prayer, but a truth. "I cannot carry this and walk freely." Then he held the pebble over the water and breathed in, fully, slowly. He breathed out and let go. The pebble fell. It didn't splash. It sank without a ripple, disappearing into the dark silence below. And Tenzin felt something in his chest soften. He sat by the pond for a long time after that, not to think, not to solve, just to be. The wind moved gently through the trees, and for once his thoughts didn't chase it. They too began to settle like a pebble, finding its place at the bottom of still water. From that day forward, he taught others not with sutras, but by handing them stones and walking them to the pond. Moral of the story: letting go is not about forgetting, it's about releasing the grip. Like the pebble that sank with intention, our burdens begin to lighten when we meet them fully, then offer them to stillness. In that small act of surrender, we don't lose something, we gain space. And in that space, peace can begin. The next story is called The Sound of Fog Dripping. In a high mountain monastery where even the wind moved slowly, fog would come and go like a breath, rolling in before dawn and vanishing by midday. It wrapped the trees, cloaked the stone paths, and softened the sky until everything seemed to float. The monks welcomed it like an old friend. One autumn morning, a young monk named Isamu sat in the temple garden just before sunrise. The world around him was silent, so silent it felt heavy. No birds, no rustling, just fog. He was supposed to be meditating, but his thoughts wandered. Why do I feel empty in all this stillness? Isn't fog just nothing? But then he heard it. Drip. Soft. Clear. Barely there. It came again. Drip. Water falling slow, patient, inevitable. A single drop of fog, condensed on the tip of a pine needle, letting go. Then another, and another. Each drop landed on stone, on leaf, on earth, like the temple's bell in miniature. Isamu opened his eyes wide. The fog was not silent. It was speaking very quietly. He began to notice more. The way the water built slowly, how the leaf bowed under its weight, the exact moment the drop fell, how it disappeared without a trace. The fog had become rain not by force, but by stillness. It gave shape to what could not be seen. It let go when the time was right. That morning, he didn't chase thoughts or force concentration. He just listened. Drip by drip, the fog taught him impermanence, patience, and the beauty of what is often missed. Later, when asked what awakened him to the Dharma, he didn't mention a sutra, a teacher, or a koan. He simply said, "The sound of fog dripping." Moral of the story: wisdom doesn't always arrive in thunder or words. Sometimes it comes in moments so small, so quiet, they are easy to overlook. Like the sound of fog dripping, life speaks gently, asking not for answers, but for presence. When we truly listen, even silence becomes a teacher. The next story is called The Cloud That Practiced Non-Attachment. Above a quiet valley where the fields breathed with golden grain and rivers moved like soft threads through the land, there drifted a single cloud. It had no name, no need, no place to rest. It simply floated, sometimes alone, sometimes among others, always moving, always changing. At times, the cloud was full and bright, glowing with sunlight. Other days, it turned heavy and grey, carrying storms across the sky. It passed over weddings, funerals, harvests, and droughts. People looked up and pointed, sometimes in wonder, sometimes in worry. But the cloud never clung to praise, nor feared judgment. It did not try to stay when the sun wanted its turn. It did not fight the wind when it pulled it elsewhere. And when the rain inside grew too full, it wept without hesitation, gently, generously, then moved on, lighter than before. A mountain once asked the cloud, "Don't you wish to settle somewhere, to belong, to be something more than passing mist?" The cloud replied, "I belong to wherever I am, and I am always becoming." Down below, a wandering monk sat on a hillside and watched the cloud drift overhead. His heart was full of sorrow. He had lost his teacher, his temple, his sense of purpose. He looked at the cloud and whispered, "What are you when you disappear?" The cloud, hearing the question in the stillness, did not answer in words, but in presence. It shifted form, softened, dissolved into sky. And the monk understood. He wept not from grief, but from freedom. The cloud had taught him, it is not the holding on that gives us life, it is the letting go. Identity, sorrow, joy, formal come and go. But the essence, the presence, it remains, even when it can't be seen. The monk stayed on that hillside until the stars came out. Then he rose, bowed to the sky, and walked on lighter than before. Moral of the story: non-attachment is not about being cold or distant. It is about flowing with life, not gripping it. Like the cloud that practiced non-attachment, we learn that freedom comes not from holding on, but from releasing with grace. What passes does not vanish, it transforms. And in that transformation, we find peace. The next story is called The Mirror That Refused to Reflect. In an old Zen temple hidden deep within the forest, there was a narrow room where a single mirror hung on the wall. It was said to be ancient, passed down through generations of masters, and was known by a strange name, the Mirror of No Reflection. Many monks were curious about it. Some believed it held magical powers. Others thought it was broken. When they stood before it, they saw nothing, not their faces, not the room behind them, not even the light of a candle held close, just smooth, unbroken darkness. A young monk named Tycho, full of questions and certainty, approached the abbot one evening. "Master," he said, "the mirror is useless. It reflects nothing." The abbot smiled gently. "Are you sure?" Tycho frowned. "Yes, I've looked into it many times. There's only emptiness." The abbot nodded. "Then you're starting to see." That night, Tycho returned alone to the mirror. He stood in silence, watching his own non-image. At first, he felt frustration, then confusion, then stillness. He noticed something he hadn't before. Without a reflection, there was nothing to judge, no appearance to fix, no past to cling to, no future to imagine. Just this moment, formless, quiet, clear. With no face staring back at him, his mind stopped performing. He didn't need to look a certain way. He didn't need to be anything at all. And in that nothingness, he began to feel free. He came back the next night, and the next. Not to look at himself, but to disappear. Over time, other monks joined him, not to see, but to not see. The mirror had become a portal, not to another world, but to the truth beyond form, where ego could not follow, where identity dissolved, where presence remained. It was said that one day a master finally removed the mirror from the wall. When asked why, she said, "Because it was never about the mirror." Moral of the story: we spend much of our lives staring at reflections of who we think we are, or who we think we must become. But awakening begins when we look into the silence beyond the surface. Like the mirror that refused to reflect, true clarity comes not from seeing ourselves, but from seeing through ourselves. The next story is called The Falling Leaf That Understood the Four Noble Truths. In the middle of autumn, when the air grew sharp and the light turned golden, a single leaf clung to the highest branch of an old maple tree in a quiet monastery garden. The tree had seen many seasons, and the monks often sat beneath it during walking meditation, watching the leaves dance and fall like soft lessons from the sky. But this one leaf held on longer than the rest. Each day the wind tugged gently. Each night the air grew colder. Still the leaf remained vibrant in color, trembling with resistance. It looked down at the ground, covered in the bodies of its fallen brothers and sisters, and whispered, "I'm not ready to let go." Then one morning, a strong gust rose through the valley. The leaf felt the branch loosen. In that moment, fear surged. What will happen to me? What am I without this tree? And then, something quiet stirred within it. It remembered. First, there is suffering. Yes, this clinging, this fear, this ache to stay it was suffering. Not because the wind was cruel, but because the leaf was holding on. Second, there is a cause to suffering. The grasping, the fear of change, the desire to remain what it had always been. Third, there is an end to suffering, not through force, but through release. Fourth, there is a path. And in that moment, the path was down into the wind, into the unknown, into the gentle surrender of falling. The leaf let go, not in despair, but in understanding. It floated through the air, carried in silence, and as it fell, it felt light, peaceful. It landed softly on the ground, beside a monk's sandal. The monk looked down, picked it up, and smiled. He placed it gently on the altar in the meditation hall. There the leaf rested, not as something lost, but as something returned. Moral of the story: the Four Noble Truths are not distant ideas. They live in every moment of release. Like the falling leaf that understood suffering, clinging, and freedom, we too must learn that peace does not come from holding on. It comes from trusting the wind, the path, and the quiet wisdom of letting go. The next story is called The Flame That Refused to Die. In a wind-swept monastery atop a craggy cliff, there burned a single flame, small, golden, and quiet. It lived inside a stone lantern at the heart of the temple courtyard, flickering day and night for generations. The monks called it Hikari no Kokoro, the flame of the heart. No one knew exactly when it had been lit. Some said it had survived wars. Others believed it was passed from a candle once held by a great Zen master on his deathbed. What everyone agreed on was this: the flame had never gone out. Storms had come, roofs had collapsed, Once, lightning struck the bell tower, but the flame endured. One year, a bitter winter arrived early. Snow piled high. Winds howled through the trees like restless spirits. Food grew scarce. The monks stayed wrapped in robes and silence, tending to their practice with breath and stillness. Then, one night, a fierce wind tore through the courtyard. The flame bent low, flickered wildly, and nearly vanished. A novice saw it happen and rushed to shield it with his cloak, trembling in fear. "Master," he cried, "the Flemiet's dying." The old abbot came slowly, placing a calm hand on the boy's shoulder. "Let it dance," he said. "Do not smother what knows how to live." So they watched. The wind blew harder. The flame bent again, leaned into the storm, quivered on the edge of extinction, and then steadied. It rose again, small but unbroken, as if it had bowed to the storm, not resisted it. The boy wept not because the flame had lived, but because he had seen in it something he hadn't seen in himself. The abbot whispered, "This is not just fire. It is the Dharma. It flickers, it wavers, but it does not die." Years later, when the abbot passed away, the novicinao ground-lit a small candle from that flame and carried it down the mountain. Wherever he traveled, he lit others. Not to preserve a legend, but to remind people. Even the smallest light can survive the fiercest winds. Moral of the story: strength is not found in never-wavering, it's in refusing to vanish. Like the flame that refused to die, our spirit may bend, tremble, nearly break. But when we meet life's storms without panic, when we trust the still center inside us, we find a light that endures, not loud, not proud, just quietly, eternally alive. The next story is called The Mountain That Recited the Heart Sutra. In a far and forgotten land, there stood a mountain wrapped in clouds and silence. Its cliffs were carved by centuries of wind, its forests thick with moss and stillness. No roads led to its peak. No maps named it, but for those who stumbled upon it, wanderers, hermits, monks in search of something they could not name, the mountain spoke. Not in words, not in sound, but in the deep, quiet rhythm of being. A wandering monk named Yori arrived one spring, weary from years of seeking. He had studied every sutra, sat through long winters of zazen, worn through sandals across temple stones. But something still felt missing. His mind buzzed with teachings, but his heart remained heavy. He climbed the mountain not for enlightenment, but for rest. At the summit, he found no shrine, no teacher, no revelation, just a flat stone, wide sky, and the hush of wind moving through pine. He sat, he closed his eyes, and he listened. The wind whispered, "Form is emptiness." The rustling trees replied, "Emptiness is form." The silence between his breaths echoed. No eyes, no ears, no nose, no tongue. The mountain did not chant, it was the chant. Every stone, every tree, every cloud passing by each line of the Heart Sutra unfolded, not as scripture, but as presence, not recited, but embodied. Yori's mind, once heavy with knowing, softened. He stopped trying to remember the lines. They were already here, not as words, but as truth, spoken in wind and weight and stillness. He bowed not to a Buddha, not to a scroll, but to the mountain itself. And for the first time in his life, he understood the sutra not as something to study, but as something to become. He descended the mountain with nothing in his hands, but everything in his heart. Moral of the story: wisdom isn't always found in temples or texts. Sometimes it lives in silence, in sky, in stone. Like the mountain that recited the Heart Sutra, truth is not always something we read, it's something we remember. When the mind quiets, the world chants, and in that stillness, everything speaks. In a world that often moves too fast and speaks too loud, These stories have reminded us of something simple, yet sacred. Stillness is not found by escaping life, but by meeting it fully, moment by moment. From the weeping stone to the laughing Zen master, from the falling leaf to the silent mountain, each tale has whispered the same quiet truth. Peace lives not outside us, but within. Let these teachings walk with you, in your breath, in your pauses, in your letting go. Now, we'd love to hear from you. Which stories stayed with you the most? Which one softened something in you, or made you see life a little differently? Share your thoughts in the comments. We're listening. And if these stories have brought a little more calm to your day, consider subscribing. Hit that subscribe button and stay connected with more moments of presence, one breath at a time.